The emergence of the Wendish peoples represents one of the most significant demographic transformations in early medieval Central Europe, originating from the vast expanses of the Pripyat Marshes region during the tumultuous centuries following the collapse of Roman authority. These wetlands, stretching across what would later become parts of Belarus and northern Ukraine, served as the demographic crucible from which successive waves of Proto-Slavic populations would venture westward, carrying with them distinctive cultural practices, agricultural techniques, and social structures that would fundamentally reshape the European landscape. The initial migration patterns began manifesting around 480 AD, when climatic pressures and population growth within the Pripyat Basin compelled various Proto-Slavic groups to seek new territories. Archaeological evidence from sites such as Komarovo and Bantsorowo reveals a gradual abandonment of traditional settlement patterns, with ceramic assemblages showing increased standardization that suggests coordinated movement rather than random dispersal. The distinctive Prague-type pottery found across these early sites demonstrates technological continuity even as populations relocated, indicating that migrating groups maintained their cultural identity while adapting to new geographical conditions. These westward movements followed established river corridors, particularly along tributaries of the Dnieper and Bug systems, which provided both navigational routes and fertile alluvial soils suitable for the mixed agricultural economy that characterized early Slavic communities. The migrants brought with them sophisticated knowledge of wetland management, including techniques for constructing elevated settlements on artificial islands and developing drainage systems that would prove invaluable in their new territories along the major Central European river systems. The Elbe River system became the primary corridor for Wendish settlement expansion, with archaeological investigations at sites like Torno and Dessau Musikau, revealing substantial occupation layers dating to the late 5th and early 6th centuries. These settlements demonstrate remarkable adaptation to local conditions, with housing structures evolving from the traditional semi-subterranean dwellings of the Pripyat region to above-ground timber constructions, better suited to the different soil conditions and climate patterns of the North European plain. Excavations at Torno have uncovered distinctive ceramic kilns and metalworking facilities, suggesting that these early communities rapidly established specialized craft production to meet the needs of expanding populations. The material culture recovered from Elbe Valley sites reveals a sophisticated understanding of riverine resource exploitation. Fishing implements, including bone hooks and net weights, appear alongside agricultural tools, indicating that these communities maintained the mixed subsistence strategies that had sustained their ancestors in the marshlands. Particularly significant are the remains of wooden fish weirs discovered at several sites, demonstrating advanced hydraulic engineering capabilities that allowed for systematic exploitation of seasonal fish runs while maintaining navigational channels for waterborne transport. Settlement patterns along the Oder River system present a different developmental trajectory, with communities establishing themselves primarily on elevated terraces overlooking the main channel and its tributaries. The site of Grossraden, though representing a later period, sits atop earlier occupation layers that demonstrate continuous habitation from the 6th century onward. These early phases reveal settlements organized around central courtyards, with residential structures arranged in roughly circular patterns that reflect social organization principles carried forward from the Proto-Slavic homeland. The archaeological record from Oder Valley sites shows evidence of extensive trade networks developing by the mid-6th century, with amber artifacts from Baltic sources appearing alongside iron implements that suggest contact with established metalworking centres. Pottery assemblages from this period display increasing regional variation, indicating that while cultural unity persisted, local adaptations were emerging in response to different environmental conditions and resource availability. Vistula river settlements present perhaps the most complex archaeological picture, with multiple occupation phases representing successive waves of migration and settlement. The site of Krakow Nowa Huta contained stratified deposits spanning from the early 6th through 8th centuries, revealing evolving construction techniques and material culture that chronicle the transformation of migrant communities into established regional populations. Early phases show typical Prague culture characteristics, with semi-subterranean houses and handmade pottery, while later levels demonstrate increasing architectural sophistication and the adoption of wheel-thrown ceramics. The linguistic evidence for this period provides crucial insights into the cultural processes accompanying territorial expansion. Proto-West Slavic, the ancestor of all Wendish languages, began diverging from the broader Slavic linguistic family during these migration centuries. Phonological innovations characteristic of West Slavic, particularly the development of nasal vowels and specific consonant cluster simplifications, can be traced through placename evidence and early loanwords into Germanic languages. The emergence of distinct dialectal groups reflects both geographical separation and contact with different substrate populations. The northern dialects, which would eventually develop into Palabian and related languages, show evidence of early contact with Germanic speakers, particularly in vocabulary related to trade and craftsmanship. Southern dialectal groups, ancestral to modern Sorbian languages, retained more conservative phonological features while developing distinctive innovations in verbal morphology that suggest different patterns of social organisation and cultural contact. Hydronymic evidence provides particularly valuable insights into the linguistic landscape of early Wendish territories. River names such as Spree, Havel, and numerous smaller waterways preserve Slavic etymologies that can be traced to specific dialectal groups, allowing reconstruction of settlement patterns and territorial boundaries. The distribution of these linguistic markers corresponds closely with archaeological evidence for early Wendish presence, confirming the reliability of both types of evidence for understanding migration patterns. The formation of early tribal confederations represents a crucial development in Wendish political organisation, moving beyond the village-level social structures characteristic of the migration period toward more complex regional identities. The Oberdreich Confederation, centred in the region between the lower Elbe and Baltic coast, emerged during the mid-6th century as a response to both internal population pressures and external threats from expanding Germanic populations. Archaeological evidence from Oberdreich territories reveals a distinctive settlement hierarchy, with fortified centres like Oldenburg and Rerich serving as focal points for surrounding agricultural communities. These early strongholds, constructed using sophisticated timber and earthwork techniques, demonstrate centralised planning and coordinated labour that indicates emerging political authority beyond the kinship-based leadership typical of smaller communities. The material culture associated with Oberdreich sites shows evidence of specialised craft production and long-distance trade connections. Bronze and silver ornaments recovered from elite burials display stylistic influences from both Scandinavian and Byzantine sources, suggesting that Oberdreich leaders were actively participating in broader European exchange networks. Weapon assemblages from warrior graves include high-quality iron spears and axes that indicate both martial prowess and access to advanced metallurgical technology. The Lutici Confederation developed along different lines, emerging in the territories between the Oder and Elbe rivers during the late 6th and early 7th centuries. Unlike the Oberdreichts, who developed centralised leadership structures, the Lutici maintained a more decentralised political organisation based on autonomous tribal groups united primarily for military purposes. Archaeological evidence from Lutici territories shows less pronounced settlement hierarchy, with fortified sites serving primarily as refuges during conflicts rather than permanent administrative centres. Lutici material culture emphasises martial aspects, with weapon deposits at cult sites like Rethra, indicating the central role of warrior bands in social organisation. The famous temple complex at Rithra, though known primarily from later written sources, sits atop earlier cult sites that demonstrate continuity of religious practices from the migration period through the development of more complex ceremonial centres. The Sorbian groups, occupying territories along the upper Elbe and its tributaries, developed yet another variant of early Wendish political organisation. Archaeological evidence from sites like Bautzen and Dresden reveals communities that maintained closer connections to southern Slavic populations while developing distinctive regional characteristics. Sorbian settlements show evidence of advanced agricultural techniques, including terraced cultivation on hillsides and sophisticated irrigation systems that maximise productivity in less favourable terrain. The ceramic traditions associated with Sorbian sites display unique decorative motifs that suggest the development of distinct artistic traditions, while maintaining technological continuity with broader West Slavic practices. Burial customs in Sorbian territories show increasing social stratification during the 7th century, with elite graves containing imported goods and specialised weapons that indicate emerging hierarchical social structures. Religious practices across all early Wendish groups show remarkable continuity with Proto-Slavic traditions, while adapting to new geographical and social conditions. Sacred groves and spring sites appear consistently across Wendish territories, with archaeological evidence indicating continuous ritual use from the migration period through later centuries. Votive deposits at these sites include both traditional offerings like pottery and food remains, as well as more elaborate items like metal ornaments and weapons that suggest evolving ceremonial practices. The development of fortified cult centres represents a significant innovation in Wendish religious organisation, moving beyond the natural sacred sites of the migration period toward constructed ceremonial complexes that served broader regional populations. These sites, often located at prominent geographical features like hilltops or river confluences, became focal points for tribal identity and political organisation. The transformation of dispersed Wendish communities into organised tribal confederations accelerated dramatically during the 7th century, driven by increasing pressures from Frankish expansion westward and the need for coordinated defence of territorial boundaries. The Veleti Confederation emerged as the most formidable of these political entities, encompassing territories stretching from the Oder River eastward to the Vistula Basin. Unlike the earlier village-based leadership structures, the Veleti developed a sophisticated system of rotating leadership among 4 primary tribal groups: the Cassini, Zirzipani, Tollense, and Redarie, each controlling distinct geographical regions while maintaining collective decision-making authority for matters affecting the entire confederation. Archaeological excavations at Beren Lubchin have revealed the material foundations of Veleti political organisation, with a massive fortified complex covering over 12 hectares and featuring multiple construction phases spanning the 7th through 9th centuries. The site's defensive earthworks, reinforced with timber palisades and incorporating sophisticated gate systems, demonstrate engineering capabilities that required coordinated labour from multiple tribal groups. Within the fortress, excavators have uncovered evidence of specialised workshops for metalworking, pottery production and textile manufacture, indicating that these centres served not merely as military strongholds, but as economic and administrative hubs for the broader confederation. The Veleti political system operated through assemblies held at rotating locations, with archaeological evidence suggesting that major gathering sites were deliberately positioned at territorial boundaries between member tribes. The site of Feldberg, located at the confluence of the Havel and its tributaries, contains extensive remains of temporary structures and cooking facilities that indicate periodic large-scale gatherings. Artifact assemblages from these sites include prestige goods from distant sources, suggesting that political meetings coincided with trade fairs and ceremonial exchanges that reinforced confederation unity while maintaining tribal autonomy. Military organisation within the Veleti Confederation reflected this decentralised political structure, with each tribal group maintaining its own warrior bands while contributing to larger forces for major campaigns. Weapon caches discovered at sites like Grossraden contain standardised spear points and axe heads that indicate coordinated production and distribution systems, while maintaining regional variations in decorative elements that preserve tribal identity. The quality of metalwork in these assemblages, particularly the complex pattern welding techniques used in sword construction, demonstrates that Valetti smiths had achieved technical parity with their Frankish and Saxon counterparts. The Oberdreich kingdom developed along markedly different organisational lines, evolving from the earlier confederation structure towards centralised monarchical authority under leaders who claimed descent from legendary founding heroes. The royal centre at Oldenburg became the focal point of this political transformation, with successive construction phases revealing increasingly elaborate residential and ceremonial complexes. Excavations in the royal quarter have uncovered foundations of timber halls exceeding 30 metres in length, with internal post arrangements suggesting spaces capable of accommodating several hundred individuals for feasting and ceremonial gatherings. Oberdreich royal authority manifested through control of trade networks connecting the Baltic coast with interior regions, particularly the lucrative amber routes linking Scandinavian sources with Carolingian markets. The port settlement at Rerik, serving as the primary commercial outlet for Oberdreich territories, developed sophisticated harbour facilities including wooden quays and warehouse structures that facilitated large-scale maritime commerce. Dendrochronological analysis of timber from these structures indicates continuous expansion and renovation throughout the 8th century, reflecting growing commercial importance and royal investment in infrastructure development. The material culture associated with Oberdreich royal sites displays distinctive characteristics that set it apart from both earlier Wendish traditions and contemporary Germanic practices. Ceramic assemblages include wheel-thrown vessels with elaborate decorative schemes incorporating geometric patterns and stylized animal motifs that suggest the development of court-sponsored artistic traditions. Metalwork from royal contexts features complex interlace patterns and inlaid decoration techniques that demonstrate both technical sophistication and cultural synthesis, combining Slavic symbolic elements with stylistic influences absorbed through diplomatic and commercial contacts. Religious practices across Wendish territories during this period evolved from the localised sacred sites of earlier centuries toward elaborate temple complexes that served as focal points for tribal and confederate identity. The cult centre at Arkana, perched on dramatic chalk cliffs overlooking the Baltic Sea, became the most significant religious site in the Wendish world, attracting pilgrims and tribute from communities across the region. Archaeological investigations at Arkona have revealed multiple construction phases, with the earliest temple structures dating to the mid-7th century and showing continuous expansion and elaboration through subsequent centuries. The temple complex at Arkona centred around a massive wooden idol of Svantovit, described in contemporary sources as standing nearly 4 metres tall and carved with intricate details including multiple faces and symbolic attributes. While the original statue has not survived, excavations have uncovered the stone foundation platform on which it stood, along with numerous votive deposits including weapons, jewellery and precious metal objects that demonstrate the site's importance in Wendish religious and political life. The temple's treasury, maintained through tribute payments from subordinate communities, funded not only religious ceremonies but also military campaigns and diplomatic initiatives. The cult centre at Rethra, located in the heart of Lutici territory, served different functions within the broader Wendish religious landscape, emphasising martial aspects of divine worship and serving as a gathering point for warrior initiations and military planning. Archaeological evidence from the site includes extensive weapon deposits, with over 300 spear points and axe heads, recovered from ritual contexts dating to the 8th and 9th centuries. These assemblages include both locally produced weapons and prestigious imports from Frankish and Scandinavian sources, suggesting that Rethra served as a focal point for warrior culture that transcended tribal boundaries. The temple at Rethra housed the cult of Radagast, a deity associated with warfare and hospitality, whose worship involved elaborate ceremonies including the ritual consumption of sacred beverages and the casting of lots to determine military strategy. Excavations have uncovered specialised brewing facilities within the temple complex, along with large quantities of drinking vessels and ceremonial implements that confirm the centrality of communal feasting and religious observance. The site's location at the intersection of major overland routes made it accessible to pilgrims from throughout Wendish territories, while maintaining its character as a distinctly martial cult centre. Sacred groves continue to play important roles in Wendish religious practice, alongside the development of constructed temple complexes, with numerous sites showing evidence of continuous ritual use from the migration period through the 9th century. The grove at Heiligendam, located near the Baltic coast in Oberdreich territory, contains archaeological evidence of elaborate wooden structures that served as temporary shelters during seasonal festivals, along with stone-lined springs that were apparently considered sacred sources. Pollen analysis from the site indicates that the grove was actively maintained through selective clearing and planting, creating a managed sacred landscape that enhanced the natural setting's spiritual significance. Military organisation across Wendish territories reflected the diverse political structures that emerged during this period, with different confederations and kingdoms developing distinct approaches to warfare and defence. The Veleti Confederation maintained a citizen militia system in which all adult males were expected to participate in military service, with specialised warrior bands forming the core of large armies during major campaigns. Archaeological evidence from Veleti settlements shows widespread distribution of weapons and military equipment, indicating that martial training and equipment maintenance were integrated into daily community life rather than confined to specialised warrior classes. Fortified settlements known as burghs proliferated throughout Wendish territories during the 8th and 9th centuries, serving multiple functions as defensive strongholds, administrative centres and commercial hubs. The burgh at Beren Lubchin exemplifies the sophisticated defensive architecture developed by Wendish engineers, featuring multiple concentric defensive lines with timber-reinforced earthworks and elaborate gate systems that channeled attackers through killing zones defended by archer positions. The site's interior organisation reveals careful planning, with residential areas separated from craft workshops and storage facilities, while maintaining clear sight lines and internal communication routes that enhance defensive effectiveness. The construction techniques employed in Wendish fortifications demonstrate remarkable engineering sophistication, with timber frameworks anchored in stone foundations and reinforced with iron clamps and brackets that provided structural stability while allowing for expansion and modification. Excavations at the Feldberg Burg have revealed evidence of sophisticated water management systems, including wooden-lined wells and drainage channels that ensured reliable water supplies during sieges while preventing the accumulation of waste that could compromise defensive positions. Warrior culture within Wendish societies emphasised personal prowess and loyalty to tribal or confederate leadership, with elaborate initiation ceremonies marking the transition from youth to warrior status. Archaeological evidence from warrior graves reveals standardised weapon sets, including spear, axe and shield, with higher status individuals receiving additional items such as swords, horse gear and imported prestige goods. The quality of metalwork in these assemblages indicates that weapon production had achieved high levels of specialisation, with master smiths creating pattern-welded blades and elaborately decorated spear points that served both practical and ceremonial functions. Trade networks connecting Wendish territories with distant regions expanded dramatically during this period, facilitated by the political stability provided by Confederate and royal authority structures. The amber trade, connecting Baltic sources with Mediterranean markets, formed the backbone of long-distance commerce, with Wendish merchants serving as intermediaries between Scandinavian suppliers and Carolingian consumers. Archaeological evidence from trading centres like Rerik and Wallin reveals the cosmopolitan character of these commercial hubs, with artefact assemblages including Byzantine silks, Rhenish glass, Islamic silver, and Scandinavian metalwork alongside locally produced goods. River systems served as the primary arteries for Wendish commercial networks, with specialised watercraft designed for navigating the shallow and variable conditions of Central European rivers. Excavations at Ralswiek have uncovered remains of several boat types, including shallow draft vessels optimised for cargo transport and faster courier boats used for communication and small-scale trade. The construction techniques employed in these vessels demonstrate sophisticated understanding of hydrodynamics and material science, with oak planks joined using iron rivets and sealed with pine tar and textile caulking that provided both flexibility and watertight integrity. Overland trade routes supplemented riverine networks, particularly for high-value, low-bulk commodities like precious metals, gems and specialised craft products. Archaeological evidence from roadside settlements reveals the infrastructure supporting overland commerce, including specialised facilities for horse care, wagon maintenance and traveller accommodation. The site at Gross-Stromkendorf contains remains of what appears to be a purpose-built trading post, with standardised storage buildings, weighing facilities and security arrangements that facilitated commercial transactions while protecting valuable goods from theft or damage. The relationship between Wendish territories and the expanding Carolingian Empire created both opportunities and challenges for trade development, with periods of military conflict alternating with diplomatic agreements that opened commercial possibilities. Carolingian sources document the establishment of formal trading agreements with various Wendish leaders, specifying the terms under which merchants could operate across territorial boundaries and establishing mechanisms for resolving commercial disputes. Archaeological evidence suggests that these agreements were generally effective, with Carolingian goods appearing consistently in Wendish archaeological contexts throughout periods of nominal political hostility. The Saxon Wars initiated by Charlemagne in 772 AD fundamentally altered the political landscape of northern Central Europe, creating ripple effects that profoundly impacted Wendish territories even before direct Carolingian military intervention reached Slavic lands. The systematic Frankish campaigns against Saxon strongholds along the Weser and Aller rivers displaced thousands of Saxon refugees who fled eastward across the Elbe, seeking sanctuary in Wendish territories and fundamentally disrupting established demographic patterns. Archaeological evidence from sites like Lüneburg and Berdavik reveals sudden abandonment layers dating to the 770s, with hastily buried treasure hoards and partially dismantled fortifications indicating the rapidity with which Saxon communities evacuated their traditional settlements. These Saxon refugees brought with them detailed knowledge of Carolingian military tactics, siege techniques, and administrative methods, intelligence that proved invaluable to Wendish leaders preparing for inevitable confrontation with Frankish expansion. The Oberdreich Confederation, occupying territories immediately east of the Saxon lands, initially adopted a pragmatic approach toward these refugees, incorporating Saxon warriors into their military forces, while extracting information about Carolingian strengths and vulnerabilities. Excavations at Oldenburg have uncovered weapon caches from this period, containing a mixture of traditional Wendish armaments and Saxon-style equipment, suggesting systematic efforts to upgrade military capabilities using refugee expertise. The Carolingian administrative apparatus established in conquered Saxon territories created new pressures on neighbouring Wendish communities through the implementation of tribute systems and territorial boundary demarcations that ignored traditional Slavic land use patterns. The establishment of Carolingian marches along the Elbe River formalised the frontier between Frankish and Wendish territories, but these administrative boundaries frequently conflicted with seasonal migration routes used by Wendish communities for hunting, fishing and pastoral activities. Archaeological surveys in the Elbe Valley region reveal evidence of abandoned seasonal camps and hunting lodges dating to the 780s, indicating that traditional subsistence patterns were disrupted by the new political arrangements. Charlemagne's construction of fortified positions along the Elbe, including major strongholds at Hamburg and Magdeburg, represented a strategic shift from temporary military campaigns to permanent territorial occupation. These fortifications, built using advanced engineering techniques and garrisoned with professional soldiers, posed unprecedented challenges to traditional Wendish military tactics based on mobility and guerrilla warfare. The fortress at Hamburg, positioned to control river traffic and overland routes, featured stone foundations supporting timber superstructures, with archaeological evidence indicating continuous expansion and reinforcement throughout the 780s and 790s as Carolingian engineers refined their defensive systems. The Oberdrite leadership under Prince Dragovit initially pursued diplomatic accommodation with Carolingian expansion, recognising the futility of direct military confrontation with the vastly superior Frankish army. This pragmatic approach involved formal submission ceremonies in which Oberdrite nobles acknowledged Carolingian suzerainty while maintaining internal autonomy over tribal affairs. Contemporary Carolingian sources describe elaborate diplomatic meetings held at Paderborn and Aachen, where Wendish leaders presented tribute payments including furs, amber, honey and slaves, while receiving symbolic gifts that confirmed their subordinate status within the expanding Carolingian political system. However, this diplomatic accommodation proved fragile when Carolingian administrators began implementing systematic Christianization policies that directly challenged fundamental aspects of Wendish religious and social organization. The destruction of sacred groves and the prohibition of traditional ritual practices created widespread resentment among Wendish communities, particularly when combined with heavy tribute demands that strained local economies. Archaeological evidence from cult sites like Gross Raiden shows deliberate destruction layers dating to the 790s, with broken ritual objects and burned temple structures indicating violent suppression of traditional religious practices. The establishment of the Hamburg-Bremen Archbishopric in 787 AD marked the beginning of systematic missionary efforts directed toward Wendish territories, representing a fundamental shift from the ad hoc evangelization attempts of earlier centuries to coordinated institutional campaigns backed by Carolingian political and military authority. Archbishop Willehad, appointed as the first leader of this ecclesiastical province, received explicit instructions to focus missionary activities on the Wendish populations beyond the Elbe, with the ultimate goal of incorporating these territories into the broader Carolingian Christian Commonwealth. The missionary strategy developed by the Hamburg-Bremen Archbishopric emphasised the construction of fortified monastery complexes that could serve multiple functions as religious centres, administrative headquarters and military strongholds. The monastery at Corvey, though located in Saxon territory, served as the primary training centre for missionaries destined for Wendish lands, with extensive facilities for language instruction, theological education and practical preparation for work among pagan populations. Archaeological excavations at Corvey have revealed specialised workshops for producing religious artefacts, books and ceremonial objects designed specifically for missionary use, including portable altars, bronze crosses and illuminated manuscripts written in simplified Latin suitable for newly converted populations. Early missionary activities among the Wendish populations followed established patterns developed during the Saxon conversion campaigns, focusing initially on the conversion of political elites whose acceptance of Christianity could facilitate broader social transformation. Missionaries like Ansgar and his successors concentrated their efforts on royal courts and noble households, offering material incentives including Carolingian political support, trade privileges and military assistance in exchange for religious conversion. The strategy proved partially successful among Oberdrite leadership, with several prominent nobles accepting baptism during ceremonial visits to Carolingian courts, though the depth and permanence of these conversions remained questionable. The construction of the first Christian churches in Wendish territories required careful negotiation between missionary objectives and local political realities, with church locations often chosen to minimise conflict with existing sacred sites while maximising visibility and accessibility for potential converts. The church at Mecklenburg, built around 800 AD, exemplifies this strategic approach, positioned on elevated ground overlooking the traditional Oberdreich royal centre, while avoiding direct encroachment on the nearby sacred grove that remained central to traditional religious practices. Archaeological investigations at the site have revealed foundations of a modest timber church with a simple rectangular nave and separate chancel, designed in the basic architectural style typical of frontier missionary establishments. Wendish resistance to forced conversion manifested through various forms of passive and active opposition that demonstrated the resilience of traditional religious beliefs and practices despite official political accommodation with Carolingian authority. The persistence of traditional burial customs provides archaeological evidence for this religious continuity, with grave goods including traditional amulets, ritual vessels, and symbolic objects appearing in supposedly Christian cemeteries throughout the early 9th century. Excavations at Volin have uncovered burial sites where Christian crosses appear alongside traditional Slavic religious symbols, suggesting syncretic practices that blended Christian and pagan elements, rather than representing complete conversion to the new faith. Sacred groves and natural cult sites continue to attract devotees despite official prohibition, with archaeological evidence indicating clandestine ritual activities at traditional locations throughout the period of early Christianization. The grove at Heiligendamm shows continuous use during the late 8th and early 9th centuries, with votive deposits and ritual objects appearing in archaeological contexts that post-date the official conversion of local political leadership. These deposits include traditional offerings like pottery vessels, metal ornaments, and food remains, alongside more elaborate items that suggest continued patronage by wealthy community members who maintained traditional religious loyalties despite public adherence to Christianity. The preservation of traditional religious practices often required adaptation to new political circumstances, with practitioners developing sophisticated methods for concealing pagan activities while maintaining the appearance of Christian orthodoxy. Archaeological evidence from domestic contexts reveals the widespread use of traditional ritual objects and symbols in private settings, with items like miniature deity figurines and protective amulets appearing in house foundations and storage areas where they would remain hidden from missionary oversight. The site at Groß-Stromkendorf has yielded numerous examples of such concealed ritual objects, including small bronze figurines depicting traditional Wendish deities and ceramic vessels decorated with pre-Christian symbolic motifs. The role of women in preserving traditional religious knowledge proved particularly significant during this period of religious transition, with archaeological and textual evidence suggesting that female practitioners maintained many aspects of traditional healing, divination, and ritual practice that gradually disappeared from male-dominated public ceremonies. Grave assemblages from female burials during the early 9th century frequently contain items associated with traditional religious practices, including herbal preparations, divination tools, and ceremonial jewellery that suggests continued involvement in pre-Christian spiritual activities, despite official conversion campaigns. Political alliances between Wendish leaders and the Carolingian Empire evolved throughout the reign of Charlemagne and his successors, reflecting the complex balance between pragmatic accommodation and resistance to cultural assimilation that characterized Wendish responses to Frankish expansion. The Oberdreich Confederation maintained its diplomatic relationship with Carolingian authority through a series of formal treaties that acknowledge Frankish suzerainty while preserving significant internal autonomy, particularly regarding traditional legal practices and local administrative arrangements. The treaty arrangements between Charlemagne and Oberdreich Prince Dragovit, formalised around 798 AD, established the framework for ongoing political cooperation that would persist through subsequent decades, despite periodic tensions and conflicts. These agreements specified tribute obligations including annual payments of silver, furs, and agricultural products, while guaranteeing Carolingian military support against hostile neighbouring tribes, particularly the Veleti Confederation, which maintained its independence and actively opposed Frankish expansion. Archaeological evidence from Obodrite territories shows increased prosperity during this period, with luxury goods and imported materials appearing more frequently in elite contexts, suggesting that the tributary relationship provided access to valuable trade networks despite its political costs. The Veleti Confederation adopted a markedly different approach toward Carolingian expansion, maintaining armed resistance and actively supporting Saxon rebels during the later phases of the Saxon Wars. This opposition strategy required significant military preparation and coordination among the four constituent tribes, with archaeological evidence from Veleti strongholds showing intensive fortification construction and weapon stockpiling during the 790s and early 800s. The fortress complex at Beren Lubchin underwent major expansion during this period, with new defensive earthworks and reinforced gate systems that incorporated lessons learned from Saxon experiences with Carolingian siege warfare. Veleti military resistance proved remarkably effective during the early phases of Carolingian expansion eastward, utilising superior knowledge of local terrain and traditional guerrilla tactics to inflict significant casualties on Frankish expeditionary forces. The campaign of 789 AD, led by Charlemagne personally, encountered fierce resistance at multiple fortified positions, with contemporary Carolingian sources acknowledging substantial losses and the failure to achieve decisive victory despite overwhelming numerical superiority. Archaeological evidence from battlefield sites in the region reveals extensive weapon deposits and hasty burial pits that confirm the intensity of these conflicts and the effectiveness of Wendish defensive strategies. The succession of Louis the Pious in 814 AD brought significant changes to Carolingian policy toward Wendish territories, with the new emperor initially pursuing more conciliatory approaches that emphasised diplomatic negotiation over military conquest. This policy shift reflected both the practical difficulties encountered in previous military campaigns and the growing administrative challenges of governing the vast Carolingian territories that had been acquired during Charlemagne's reign. Louis the Pious recognised that sustainable control over Wendish territories required the cooperation of local elites, rather than their complete subjugation, leading to more flexible arrangements that accommodated traditional Wendish political structures within the broader Carolingian framework. The diplomatic initiatives undertaken during Louis the Pious's reign included formal recognition of traditional Wendish territorial boundaries and legal customs, provided these arrangements did not conflict with fundamental Christian principles or Carolingian administrative requirements. This approach proved more successful than previous military campaigns in achieving stable relationships with Wendish leaders, though it also created opportunities for traditional religious practices to persist under the cover of official Christian conversion. Archaeological evidence from this period shows continued construction and maintenance of traditional cult sites alongside the establishment of Christian churches, suggesting that religious syncretism became the practical reality despite official policies promoting complete conversion. The death of Emperor Otto II in December 983 triggered the most catastrophic collapse of German imperial authority in Eastern Europe since the Magyar invasions of the previous century. Within weeks of the emperor's demise reaching Wendish territories, coordinated uprisings erupted simultaneously across the entire frontier from the Baltic coast to Bohemian borderlands, suggesting extensive prior planning and communication networks that had operated beneath the surface of apparent submission to Saxon rule. The revolt began on June 29, 983, when Wendish forces launched simultaneous attacks on German strongholds at Havelberg, Brandenburg and Zeitz, overwhelming surprised garrisons and capturing vast quantities of weapons, supplies and siege equipment that would sustain the rebellion for decades. The immediate catalyst for this massive coordinated uprising stemmed from the increasingly oppressive tribute demands imposed by Saxon administrators during Otto II's Italian campaigns, which had drained imperial resources and necessitated ever higher extractions from frontier territories. Archaeological evidence from destroyed German settlements reveals systematic looting focused specifically on metalwork, weapons, and religious objects, indicating that Wendish forces were implementing carefully planned resource acquisition strategies rather than engaging in random destruction. The fortress at Brandenburg, which had served as the primary administrative centre for Saxon control over Haveli territories, fell after a 3-day siege that demonstrated sophisticated Wendish understanding of siege warfare techniques, including the use of captured German siege engines turned against their former operators. The coordination required for such widespread simultaneous action reveals the existence of extensive communication networks linking Wendish communities across hundreds of kilometres, networks that had apparently functioned throughout the period of nominal German dominance while remaining completely undetected by Saxon administrators. Messenger routes followed ancient paths through sacred groves and along traditional pilgrimage circuits, with coded messages transmitted through religious festivals and seasonal gatherings that appeared innocuous to German observers but carried detailed military intelligence and coordination instructions. The cult centre at Rethra served as a crucial hub for this communication system, with pilgrims arriving from throughout Wendish territories carrying information about German troop movements, fortification weaknesses, and local political developments that enabled precise timing of the uprising. The military leadership of the revolt demonstrated remarkable strategic sophistication, with Wendish commanders implementing coordinated campaigns that prevented German forces from concentrating their superior resources against individual rebel strongholds. The Lutici Confederation, under the leadership of war chiefs whose names remain unrecorded in German sources, but whose tactical brilliance is evident in archaeological remains of their campaigns, adopted a strategy of rapid movement between fortified positions that kept Saxon forces constantly off balance and unable to predict where the next attack would occur. Excavations at Lentzen have revealed evidence of a German relief force that was ambushed and completely destroyed while attempting to reinforce the besieged fortress, with weapon deposits and mass burial sites indicating casualties numbering in the hundreds. The destruction of Christian infrastructure formed a central component of the Wendish uprising, with churches, monasteries, and religious artifacts becoming primary targets for systematic elimination throughout the rebel territories. The cathedral at Havelberg, which had served as the primary symbol of German Christian authority over the Haveli tribe, was completely demolished with such thoroughness that later German sources described the site as appearing never to have been inhabited. Archaeological investigations at the site have confirmed this complete destruction, with building stones scattered across a wide area and religious artifacts showing evidence of deliberate mutilation, including bronze crosses that were bent into unrecognisable shapes and altar vessels that were hammered flat before being discarded in refuse pits. The monastery at Kalbe, which had served as a missionary training centre for evangelisation efforts among the Wendish populations, suffered particularly systematic destruction that reveals detailed knowledge of Christian institutional organisation and symbolic significance. The monastery's library, containing hundreds of manuscripts including German translations of religious texts specifically prepared for Wendish conversion efforts, was completely destroyed through careful burning that consumed the parchment while preserving the metal clasps and decorative elements that were subsequently melted down for military use. The monastery's workshops, which had produced religious artifacts and ceremonial objects for distribution among newly converted Wendish communities, were dismantled with precision that suggests the involvement of former workers who understood the production processes and could efficiently salvage valuable materials and tools. The restoration of traditional Wendish religious practices followed immediately upon the destruction of Christian infrastructure, with elaborate ceremonies marking the rededication of ancient sacred sites and the reconstruction of temple complexes that had been abandoned or destroyed during the period of German dominance. The temple at Arkona underwent massive reconstruction during the winter of 983. 984, with archaeological evidence revealing the installation of a new wooden idol of Svantevit that stood even taller than its predecessor and incorporated decorative elements that may have been crafted from melted Christian religious objects. The reconstruction work required coordinated labour from communities across the island of Rügen, with specialised craftsmen arriving from distant territories to contribute their skills to the restoration project. Sacred groves throughout Wendish territories experienced similar restoration efforts, with communities working to remove Christian symbols and structures while replanting native tree species and reconstructing traditional ritual facilities. The grove at Heiligendamm, which had been partially cleared for the construction of a Christian chapel, was completely restored to its traditional configuration through careful replanting and the construction of new wooden structures for ceremonial use. Archaeological evidence from the site includes deposits of Christian religious objects that were ritually destroyed and buried beneath newly planted oak trees, suggesting elaborate ceremonies that symbolically reversed the Christian conversion process and restored the spiritual integrity of traditional sacred spaces. The revival of traditional religious practices extended beyond the restoration of physical sites to include the re-establishment of ceremonial cycles and ritual observances that had been suppressed during the period of Christian dominance. The autumn harvest festivals of 984 were celebrated with unprecedented elaboration throughout Wendish territories, with contemporary German sources describing the sound of ritual drums and ceremonial horns echoing across the frontier regions, as communities publicly demonstrated their return to ancestral religious traditions. These celebrations served multiple functions beyond their religious significance, providing opportunities for military coordination, information exchange, and the distribution of captured German resources among participating communities. The role of traditional religious leadership proved crucial in maintaining the unity and coordination of the Wendish uprising, with priests and ritual specialists serving as communication links between distant communities while providing ideological justification for continued resistance against German attempts at reconquest. The high priest at Rethra emerged as a particularly influential figure, issuing pronouncements that framed the uprising in explicitly religious terms as a sacred war to restore the proper relationship between the Wendish peoples and their traditional deities. These religious pronouncements were disseminated throughout Wendish territories through networks of travelling priests and ritual specialists who carried standardised messages that maintained ideological coherence across the diverse tribal groups participating in the rebellion. The military effectiveness of Wendish resistance forces improved dramatically as the uprising progressed, with captured German equipment and the incorporation of Saxon refugees providing access to advanced weapons technology and tactical knowledge. The fortress at Grossraden was extensively modified during 984, 985 using engineering techniques learned from captured German siege specialists, with new defensive works incorporating features like angled bastions and overlapping fields of fire that reflected sophisticated understanding of contemporary military architecture. Weapon assemblages from Wendish sites during this period show increasing standardization and quality, with locally produced spear points and axe heads displaying technical characteristics that match or exceed German military equipment. The economic foundations of Wendish resistance proved remarkably sustainable, with traditional subsistence strategies supplemented by systematic exploitation of captured German resources and the revival of trade networks that had been disrupted during the period of Saxon dominance. The port at Wollin experienced dramatic expansion during the mid-980s, as Wendish merchants re-established commercial connections with Scandinavian trading partners who had been excluded from German-controlled markets. Archaeological evidence from the site reveals extensive warehouse construction and the establishment of specialised craft workshops that processed raw materials acquired through both trade and military capture into finished goods suitable for long-distance commerce. The agricultural productivity of Wendish territories increased substantially following the elimination of German tribute obligations, with communities able to retain the full output of their farming and pastoral activities for local consumption and trade. Archaeological surveys in the Havel River Valley reveal evidence of agricultural intensification during the late 10th century, with new field systems and improved drainage works that suggest coordinated community investment in productive infrastructure. The elimination of German administrative interference also allowed for the restoration of traditional seasonal migration patterns that optimize resource exploitation across diverse ecological zones, with archaeological evidence showing renewed use of temporary camps and specialized activity sites that had been abandoned during the period of Saxon control. The diplomatic isolation of German frontier territories became increasingly severe as the Wendish uprising gained momentum and demonstrated its capacity for sustained resistance against imperial military efforts. The Oberdreich Confederation, which had maintained nominal loyalty to German authority throughout the early phases of the revolt, gradually shifted toward active participation in the rebellion, as it became clear that German forces lacked the capacity for effective retaliation. Prince Mstivoje of the Oberdreights formally renounced his tributary obligations to the German Empire in 985, leading to the systematic destruction of German trading posts and administrative centres throughout Oberdreich territories. The strategic implications of Wendish military success extended far beyond the immediate frontier regions, with the collapse of German authority east of the Elbe creating opportunities for broader anti-imperial coalitions that threatened the stability of the entire Saxon duchy. Polish Duke Mieszko I, while maintaining official neutrality in the conflict, provided covert support to Wendish resistance forces through the supply of weapons and military advisors, recognising that successful Wendish independence would create a buffer zone protecting Polish territories from German expansion. Archaeological evidence from border regions between Polish and Wendish territories reveals increased trade and communication during this period, with artefact assemblages showing the movement of specialised military equipment and precious metals that suggest systematic cooperation despite the absence of formal alliance agreements. The psychological impact of Wendish military victories reverberated throughout the German Empire, challenging fundamental assumptions about Saxon military superiority and the inevitability of Christian expansion into pagan territories. Contemporary German chronicles describe widespread panic among frontier populations as news of Wendish successes spread, with many Saxon settlers abandoning their holdings and retreating westward rather than risk capture or death at the hands of resurgent pagan forces. The fortress at Magdeburg, which had served as the primary staging area for German military operations against Wendish territories, was reinforced with additional troops and defensive works, as imperial authorities recognised the genuine threat posed by coordinated Wendish resistance. The emergence of charismatic military leaders among the Wendish forces provided crucial coordination and strategic direction that transformed what might have been isolated tribal uprisings into a sustained and effective resistance movement. The war chief known in German sources only as Mistui demonstrated exceptional tactical skill in coordinating attacks across multiple tribal territories, with archaeological evidence suggesting that his forces developed innovative combined arms tactics that integrated traditional Wendish mobility with captured German heavy weapons and siege equipment. The systematic nature of Wendish military operations under such leadership suggests the development of professional military institutions that could maintain operational effectiveness across extended campaign seasons. The fortification systems developed by Wendish communities during the uprising period incorporated both traditional defensive concepts and innovations derived from captured German military technology, creating hybrid defensive architectures that proved remarkably effective against imperial siege attempts. The fortress at Beren Lubchin underwent extensive modification during the mid-980s, with new earthworks and timber reinforcements that incorporated German engineering principles while maintaining the advantages of traditional Wendish defensive design. Archaeological investigation of these modifications reveals sophisticated understanding of ballistic principles and siege warfare tactics that enabled relatively small garrison forces to withstand attacks by much larger German armies. The religious dimensions of Wendish resistance provided crucial ideological cohesion that sustained military efforts through periods of tactical setback and resource shortage, with traditional spiritual practices serving to maintain morale and community solidarity under the extreme pressures of prolonged warfare. The ritual calendar observed throughout Wendish territories during the uprising period emphasized martial ceremonies and warrior initiation rites that channeled religious devotion toward military effectiveness, with archaeological evidence from cult sites revealing extensive weapon deposits and warrior grave goods that demonstrate the integration of spiritual and military aspects of resistance culture. The failure of German attempts at reconquest during the late 980s and early 990s reflected both the military effectiveness of Wendish resistance and the broader political crisis within the German Empire following Otto II's death and the minority of Otto III. Imperial resources were stretched across multiple frontier conflicts, with Magyar raids in the southeast and ongoing tensions with France limiting the forces available for operations against Wendish territories. The campaign of 991, led by Margrave Eckhard of Meissen, ended in complete disaster when German forces were ambushed while crossing the Spree River, with archaeological evidence from the battle site revealing the remains of hundreds of German soldiers who were killed or drowned during the chaotic retreat. The consolidation of Wendish territorial control during the 990s established the foundations for sustained independence that would persist for decades, with the development of administrative institutions and military organisations capable of maintaining effective governance over the liberated territories. The confederation structure that emerged during this period balanced traditional tribal autonomy with the coordination requirements of ongoing resistance against German reconquest attempts, creating flexible political arrangements that could adapt to changing military and diplomatic circumstances while preserving essential cultural and religious traditions. The proclamation of the Second Crusade by Pope Eugene III in March 1146 fundamentally transformed the nature of German-Wendish relations from localised frontier conflicts into a coordinated pan-European religious war that would ultimately destroy the last vestiges of independent Wendish political organisation. The papal bull Divini Dispensatione, issued specifically to authorise crusading operations against the Wendish territories, granted the same spiritual indulgences available to crusaders bound for the Holy Land to those participating in campaigns against the pagan Slavs, effectively legitimising total warfare against populations that had successfully resisted German expansion for over a century and a half. This religious authorisation attracted military participation from across the Holy Roman Empire and beyond, with contingents arriving from Denmark, Poland, and even France to participate in what contemporary sources described as the final solution to the Wendish problem. The strategic planning for the Wendish Crusade began during the Diet of Frankfurt in March 1147, where German nobles and ecclesiastical leaders developed a comprehensive campaign strategy that divided the Wendish territories into distinct operational zones assigned to specific military commanders. Henry the Lion, Duke of Saxony, received responsibility for operations against the Oberdreich Confederation and the Baltic coastal regions, while Albert the Bear, Margrave of Brandenburg, was tasked with conquering the Lüttici territories and re-establishing German control over the Middle Elbe region. Conrad of Wettin, Margrave of Meissen, would coordinate attacks against the Sorbian populations in the southeast, while Danish forces under King Canute V would provide naval support and conduct amphibious operations against Wendish strongholds on the Baltic islands. The military preparations undertaken during the spring and summer of 1147 dwarfed any previous German military effort against Wendish territories, with archaeological evidence from assembly points like Magdeburg and Brunswick revealing massive accumulations of weapons, siege equipment, and supplies that indicate an army numbering in the tens of thousands. The logistical complexity of maintaining such forces required unprecedented coordination between secular and ecclesiastical authorities, with monasteries throughout the German territories contributing financial resources, supplies, and specialised personnel including engineers, medical staff, and interpreters familiar with Wendish languages and customs. The Cistercian monasteries proved particularly crucial in providing organisational support, with their extensive networks of granges and administrative centres serving as staging areas for the accumulation and distribution of military supplies. The siege equipment assembled for the Crusade incorporated the most advanced military technology available in 12th century Europe, with master engineers recruited from across the continent to construct specialised devices designed specifically for attacking Wendish fortifications. Archaeological investigations at former siege sites have revealed the remains of massive trebuchets and mangonels that required teams of oxen to transport and specialised crews to operate, representing a quantum leap in military capability compared to the relatively simple siege techniques employed in earlier German campaigns. The construction of these devices required extensive timber resources, with entire forests being cleared to provide the oak beams and specialised hardwoods necessary for building effective siege engines. Henry the Lion's northern campaign commenced in July 1147 with a coordinated assault on the Oberdrecht stronghold at Dobbin, which had served as a crucial defensive position controlling access to the Mecklenburg region. The fortress, situated on an island in the Schwerener Sea, had been continuously fortified and expanded since the Great Uprising of 983, with archaeological evidence revealing multiple construction phases that incorporated increasingly sophisticated defensive features, including angled bastions, overlapping fields of fire, and elaborate water obstacles designed to channel attackers into killing zones. The siege lasted for 6 weeks, with German forces employing floating platforms to transport siege engines across the lake, while Wendish defenders utilised their superior knowledge of local water conditions to conduct night raids against the besieging forces. The fall of Dobbin in September 1147 marked the beginning of systematic German penetration into the heart of Oberdrecht territory, with Henry the Lion's forces advancing methodically from fortress to fortress, while establishing permanent garrisons at each captured position to prevent Wendish reoccupation. The strategic approach differed markedly from earlier German campaigns that had focused on rapid raids and tribute extraction, instead implementing a deliberate policy of territorial occupation and administrative integration that would make Wendish independence impossible to restore. Archaeological evidence from this campaign reveals the systematic destruction of traditional Wendish defensive works, with timber palisades being burned and earthworks being deliberately filled in to prevent their future military use. The siege of Oldenburg, the traditional capital of the Oberdrecht Confederation, began in October 1147 and continued through the harsh winter months as German forces attempted to starve the defenders into submission. The fortress, perched on elevated ground overlooking the Oldenburger Graben, had been expanded and reinforced continuously since the 10th century, with archaeological investigations revealing defensive works that incorporated both traditional Wendish earth and timber construction and innovations derived from captured German military technology. The defenders, led by the Oberdrecht Prince Niklot, demonstrated remarkable resilience and tactical skill, conducting sorties that inflicted substantial casualties on the besieging forces while maintaining morale through the distribution of supplies that had been stockpiled in anticipation of prolonged siege. The breakthrough at Oldenburg came in March 1148, when German engineers succeeded in undermining a section of the fortress wall, creating a breach that allowed assault forces to penetrate the outer defensive perimeter. The subsequent fighting within the fortress complex demonstrated the desperate nature of Wendish resistance, with archaeological evidence revealing extensive fire damage and weapon deposits that indicate prolonged close-quarters combat throughout the residential and administrative areas. The capture of Oldenburg provided German forces with access to the extensive treasure accumulated by the Oberdreich leadership over decades of successful resistance, including precious metals, religious artifacts, and weapons that were redistributed among the crusading forces as both practical resources and symbolic trophies. The destruction of the Arkona temple complex on the island of Rügen in June 1168 represented the symbolic culmination of the Northern Crusades, eliminating the most significant centre of Wendish religious and cultural identity that had served as a focal point for resistance against German expansion for nearly 2 centuries. The temple, dedicated to the four-faced god Svantevit, had been continuously expanded and enriched since its reconstruction following the uprising of 983, with archaeological evidence revealing a complex of buildings that included the main temple structure, subsidiary shrines, residential quarters for priests and temple servants, and extensive treasury facilities that housed the accumulated wealth of Wendish communities throughout the Baltic region. The assault on Arkona required specialised amphibious capabilities that combined Danish naval expertise with German siege technology, resulting in the construction of specialised vessels capable of transporting heavy siege equipment across the treacherous waters surrounding Rügen. The preliminary naval bombardment, conducted using ship-mounted catapults and Greek fire projectors acquired from Byzantine sources, succeeded in destroying the harbour facilities and eliminating the small fleet of Wendish warships that had previously made the island virtually impregnable to seaborne assault. Archaeological investigations of the harbour area have revealed the remains of burned ship timbers and melted bronze fittings that confirm the effectiveness of these preliminary attacks in eliminating Wendish naval capabilities. The siege of the Arkona fortress itself lasted for 3 months, with German and Danish forces establishing a complete blockade that prevented the delivery of supplies while conducting systematic bombardment of the defensive works using the largest siege engines available to 12th century military technology. The fortress walls, constructed using a combination of stone foundations and timber superstructures, proved remarkably resistant to conventional siege techniques, requiring the development of innovative approaches, including the use of specialised boring devices designed to weaken the structural integrity of the defensive works. Archaeological evidence from the siege reveals extensive use of incendiary weapons, with large quantities of melted lead and bronze artefacts indicating temperatures sufficient to compromise the metal reinforcements that held the defensive structures together. The final assault on Arkona began at dawn on June 15, 1168, with coordinated attacks against multiple sections of the fortress perimeter designed to prevent the defenders from concentrating their forces at any single point. The breakthrough came when German sappers succeeded in creating a large enough breach in the eastern wall to allow the passage of armoured cavalry, whose charge into the fortress courtyard broke the organised resistance of the Wendish defenders. The subsequent destruction of the temple complex was conducted with systematic thoroughness that reflected both military necessity and religious zealotry, with the massive wooden idol of Svantevit being dismantled piece by piece and burned in a ceremonial fire that lasted for 3 days. The treasure recovered from Arkona exceeded even the most optimistic expectations of the crusading forces, with contemporary sources describing quantities of gold, silver, precious stones, and exotic materials that had been accumulated through centuries of tribute payments and religious offerings from Wendish communities throughout northern Europe. Archaeological investigations have confirmed the extraordinary wealth of the temple complex, with excavations revealing hidden chambers and underground storage facilities that contained thousands of silver coins, elaborate jewellery, precious weapons, and religious artifacts crafted from materials including amber, ivory, and rare metals that demonstrate the extensive trade networks controlled by the Wendish religious establishment. Albert the Bear's simultaneous campaign against the Lutici Confederation followed a different strategic approach that emphasised rapid movement and the systematic elimination of Wendish military capabilities rather than prolonged siege warfare. The Lutici territories centred around the fortified positions at Lenzen, Havelberg and Brandenburg presented different tactical challenges than the coastal strongholds targeted by Henry the Lion, with extensive river systems and marshland environments that favoured the traditional Wendish tactics of mobility and guerrilla warfare. Albert's forces adapted to these conditions by employing large numbers of light cavalry and specialised rivercraft that could pursue Wendish forces into terrain that had previously served as secure refuges. The Battle of Urchin in August 1147 demonstrated the effectiveness of these tactical adaptations, with Albert's forces achieving a decisive victory over a large Lutici army that had attempted to relieve the besieged fortress at Demmin. The engagement began with a traditional Wendish cavalry charge, designed to break the German battle line. But Albert's commanders had anticipated this tactic and positioned their heavy cavalry in concealed positions that could strike the Wendish forces in the flank once they were committed to the frontal assault. Archaeological evidence from the battlefield reveals extensive weapon deposits and mass burial sites that indicate casualties numbering in the thousands, with the Lutici losing not only a substantial portion of their military forces, but also much of their experienced leadership. The systematic colonisation policies implemented in conquered Wendish territories represented a fundamental departure from earlier German approaches that had focused primarily on tribute extraction and nominal political control. The new colonial administration, supervised directly by the German royal court, established comprehensive settlement programs designed to replace the existing Wendish population with German colonists who would provide reliable military service and agricultural productivity. These colonisation efforts required massive logistical coordination, with entire communities being relocated from overcrowded regions of Germany to establish new settlements in the conquered territories. The establishment of German administrative control involved the construction of an entirely new infrastructure of castles, administrative centres, and religious institutions designed to maintain permanent German dominance over the conquered populations. The castle at Brandenburg, rebuilt following its capture from Wendish forces, became the model for subsequent German fortifications throughout the region, with massive stone walls, sophisticated gate systems, and residential quarters capable of housing substantial garrisons on a permanent basis. Archaeological investigations at Brandenburg have revealed the systematic demolition of earlier Wendish structures to provide building materials for the German fortress, symbolically demonstrating the replacement of Wendish political authority with German administrative control. The religious transformation of conquered territories proceeded simultaneously with military occupation, with the systematic destruction of Wendish cult sites, accompanied by the construction of Christian churches and monasteries designed to serve both spiritual and administrative functions. The cathedral at Havelberg, rebuilt on the site of the earlier structure destroyed during the uprising of 983, incorporated architectural elements that deliberately contrasted with traditional Wendish building styles, using imported stone and sophisticated engineering techniques that demonstrated German technological superiority. The cathedral's design included defensive features that allowed it to serve as a fortress during periods of unrest, with thick walls, narrow windows, and internal arrangements that could accommodate military garrisons alongside religious personnel. The economic integration of conquered Wendish territories into the broader German administrative system required fundamental changes in agricultural practices, land tenure arrangements, and commercial relationships that had evolved over centuries of independent development. German colonial administrators implemented the manorial system throughout the conquered regions, replacing traditional Wendish collective land use patterns with individual holdings tied to feudal obligations and military service requirements. Archaeological evidence from rural sites reveals the systematic reorganisation of field systems and settlement patterns during this period, with new village layouts and agricultural techniques that reflected German farming practices rather than traditional Wendish methods. The resistance to German colonisation efforts persisted throughout the conquest period, with Wendish communities employing various strategies to maintain their cultural identity and traditional practices despite official policies designed to eliminate all traces of pre-Christian civilization. Archaeological evidence from domestic sites reveals the continued use of traditional Wendish pottery styles, cooking techniques, and household organisation patterns well into the 13th century, suggesting that cultural assimilation proceeded much more slowly than German administrators had anticipated. The persistence of traditional burial customs provides particularly clear evidence of cultural resistance, with grave goods and burial orientations that reflect pre-Christian beliefs appearing in supposedly Christian cemeteries throughout the conquered territories. The final phase of the Northern Crusade involved the systematic elimination of remaining Wendish strongholds that had managed to maintain independence through the initial wave of German conquest, with particular attention focused on the island fortresses and coastal positions that had served as refuges for displaced Wendish populations. The Siege of Wollin in 1173 marked the end of organised Wendish resistance in the Baltic region, with the capture of this crucial trading centre eliminating the last significant source of economic support for Wendish military forces. The destruction of Wollin's commercial infrastructure, including its harbour facilities, warehouses and craft workshops, effectively ended the independent Wendish participation in Baltic trade networks that had provided crucial resources for military resistance. The transformation of conquered Wendish territories into integrated components of the German administrative system required decades of sustained effort that extended far beyond the initial military campaigns, with ongoing programs of settlement, fortification, and cultural transformation that gradually eliminated the demographic and cultural foundations of Wendish identity. The success of these policies can be measured through archaeological evidence that shows the progressive disappearance of distinctively Wendish material culture and its replacement with standardized German forms that reflected the complete integration of these territories into the broader European Christian Commonwealth. The systematic colonization of former Wendish territories following the Northern Crusades represented one of the most comprehensive demographic transformations in medieval European history, fundamentally altering not only the ethnic composition of vast regions between the Elbe and Oder rivers, but also introducing entirely new systems of agricultural production, urban organisation, and legal administration that would permanently reshape the cultural landscape of Central Europe. The Aussiedlung movement, beginning in earnest during the 1160s under the direct supervision of German princes like Henry the Lion and Albert the Bear, involved the coordinated relocation of hundreds of thousands of German-speaking colonists from overcrowded regions of the Holy Roman Empire to establish permanent settlements in territories that had been cleared of their indigenous Wendish populations through military conquest and systematic deportation. The recruitment of German colonists followed carefully planned strategies that targeted specific demographic groups whose skills and social organisation would prove most effective in establishing stable settlements in the conquered territories. Flemish farmers, renowned throughout medieval Europe for their advanced agricultural techniques and experience in draining marshlands, formed a significant component of the early colonial population, bringing with them sophisticated knowledge of hydraulic engineering and intensive farming methods that could maximise productivity from the heavy clay soils characteristic of much of the former Wendish territory. Archaeological excavations at colonial sites like Jüterbog and Luckenwald have revealed distinctive Flemish pottery styles and agricultural implements that confirm the presence of these specialised settlers, along with field systems and drainage works that demonstrate the immediate implementation of their advanced farming techniques. Saxon peasants from the overcrowded regions around Brunswick and Goslar comprised another major component of the colonial population, attracted by promises of land grants and tax exemptions that offered opportunities for social advancement impossible in their traditional homeland. These colonists brought with them established patterns of village organisation and agricultural practice that had proven successful in similar environmental conditions, along with legal traditions and customary practices that would form the foundation for colonial administrative systems. The village of Flaming, established around 1174, exemplifies the systematic approach to Saxon colonisation, with archaeological evidence revealing a planned settlement layout that incorporated standardised house plots, communal facilities, and field systems that maximised both agricultural productivity and defensive capabilities. Thuringian craftsmen and merchants formed a crucial component of the colonial population, providing the specialised skills necessary for establishing urban centres and commercial networks in territories that had previously relied primarily on subsistence agriculture and limited local trade. These urban colonists concentrated in newly established market towns like Salzwedel and Stendal, where they established workshops, guilds, and commercial institutions that rapidly integrated the conquered territories into broader European economic networks. Archaeological investigations at these colonial towns have uncovered extensive remains of craft workshops specialising in metalworking, pottery production, textile manufacture, and leatherworking, with artefact assemblages that demonstrate both the high quality of colonial craft production and its immediate integration into long-distance trade relationships. The transformation of existing Wendish settlements into German colonial towns required systematic demolition and reconstruction that eliminated virtually all traces of pre-conquest cultural patterns, while establishing entirely new urban layouts designed to accommodate German legal and social institutions. The former Wendish stronghold at Brandenburg underwent complete reconstruction following its capture in 1157, with German engineers demolishing the traditional circular fortification layout and replacing it with a rectangular grid system that incorporated separate districts for administrative, commercial, and residential functions. Archaeological evidence from the reconstruction reveals the systematic reuse of Wendish building materials, with carved stone blocks and timber beams from demolished structures being incorporated into new German buildings in ways that symbolically demonstrated the subordination of Wendish culture to German administrative authority. The introduction of German legal systems throughout the conquered territories represented a fundamental transformation in social organisation that extended far beyond simple administrative convenience to encompass comprehensive changes in property rights, social relationships, and community governance structures. The implementation of Magdeburg law in colonial towns established standardised legal procedures and commercial regulations that facilitated trade and urban development, while ensuring German administrative control over all aspects of colonial life. Contemporary documents from towns like Stendal and Salzwedel reveal the systematic application of German legal principles to resolve disputes involving land tenure, commercial transactions, and criminal matters, with legal procedures that explicitly excluded traditional Wendish customary practices and required all legal proceedings to be conducted in German rather than Slavic languages. Rural areas experienced equally comprehensive legal transformation through the implementation of German manorial systems that replaced traditional Wendish collective land use patterns with individual peasant holdings tied to feudal obligations and military service requirements. The establishment of German manor houses throughout the conquered territories created new centres of local administration that supervised agricultural production, collected taxes and feudal dues, and maintained military forces capable of suppressing any resurgence of Wendish resistance. Archaeological investigations at manor sites like Hundesberg and Gross Amtsleben have revealed substantial residential complexes surrounded by administrative buildings, workshops, and storage facilities that demonstrate the comprehensive nature of German administrative control over rural populations. agricultural practices throughout the former Wendish territories underwent systematic transformation as German colonists introduced advanced farming techniques that dramatically increased productivity while requiring fundamental changes in land use patterns and labour organisation. The implementation of the three-field system replaced traditional Wendish extensive farming methods with intensive cultivation techniques that maximised yields from available agricultural land, while maintaining soil fertility through systematic crop rotation and fallowing practices. Archaeological surveys in the Magdeburg region have revealed extensive evidence of field system reorganisation during the late 12th century, with new boundary markers, drainage ditches and field layouts that reflect the systematic implementation of German agricultural methods across thousands of hectares of former Wendish territory. The introduction of heavy-wheeled ploughs drawn by teams of oxen represented a technological revolution that enabled German colonists to cultivate the heavy clay soils of the North European plain far more effectively than had been possible using traditional Wendish light ploughs and manual cultivation techniques. Archaeological excavations at colonial settlements have uncovered numerous examples of these advanced agricultural implements, along with specialised workshops for their construction and maintenance that indicate the rapid establishment of technological infrastructure necessary to support intensive agricultural production. The increased agricultural productivity resulting from these technological innovations enabled colonial settlements to support much larger populations than had been possible under traditional Wendish farming systems, facilitating rapid demographic growth and territorial expansion throughout the conquered regions. Livestock management practices introduced by German colonists incorporated selective breeding techniques and specialised feeding programs that dramatically improved the quality and quantity of animal products available to colonial communities. Archaeological evidence from sites like Jericho and Tangermünde reveals the construction of sophisticated barn complexes and animal housing facilities that enabled year-round livestock maintenance and selective breeding programs that produced larger, more productive animals than traditional Wendish pastoral practices had achieved. The introduction of new livestock breeds, including heavy draft horses capable of pulling wheeled ploughs and improved cattle breeds selected for milk and meat production, provided colonial settlements with animal resources that supported both agricultural intensification and improved nutrition for the colonial population. Craftsmanship in the colonial territories rapidly achieved levels of sophistication that exceeded anything previously seen in Wendish regions, with German artisans establishing workshops and production centres that manufactured goods for both local consumption and long-distance trade. The metalworking industry experienced particularly dramatic development, with colonial smiths producing high-quality tools, weapons, and household implements, using advanced techniques that had been refined in the established craft centres of Germany. Archaeological investigations at colonial craft sites have revealed evidence of specialised furnaces, advanced forging techniques, and quality control methods that enabled colonial metalworkers to produce goods that competed successfully with established production centres throughout Europe. Pottery production in the colonial territories demonstrates the systematic replacement of traditional Wendish ceramic traditions with standardised German forms that reflected both technological advancement and cultural assimilation policies designed to eliminate indigenous cultural practices. Colonial potters introduced wheel-thrown ceramics, advanced kiln designs, and standardised vessel forms that provided superior functionality while symbolically representing the technological superiority of German culture over traditional Wendish practices. Archaeological assemblages from colonial sites show the rapid disappearance of traditional Wendish hand-built pottery styles and their replacement with German ceramic forms that were produced using advanced manufacturing techniques and distributed through organised commercial networks. Textile production experienced similar transformation through the introduction of improved looms, spinning techniques, and fibre processing methods that enabled colonial communities to produce higher quality fabrics for both domestic use and commercial exchange. The establishment of fulling mills and specialised dyeing facilities provided colonial textile producers with technological capabilities that had been unavailable to traditional Wendish communities, while the introduction of new fibre sources, including improved wool breeds and imported materials like silk and fine linen, expanded the range of textile products available to colonial consumers. Urban development patterns in the colonial territories reflected comprehensive planning strategies that incorporated both practical considerations of defence and administration and symbolic elements designed to demonstrate German cultural superiority over conquered Wendish populations. Colonial towns were typically established using standardised grid layouts that maximised commercial efficiency while providing clear sight lines for defensive purposes, with central market squares surrounded by administrative buildings, churches and guild halls that served as focal points for colonial social and economic life. Archaeological investigations at towns like Gardelegen and Osterberg have revealed evidence of systematic urban planning that incorporated advanced infrastructure, including paved streets, drainage systems, and water supply facilities that provided colonial urban populations with living conditions superior to those available in most contemporary European cities. The construction of stone churches and cathedrals throughout the colonial territories represented both practical religious needs and symbolic assertions of German Christian authority over formerly pagan lands, with architectural styles that deliberately contrasted with traditional Wendish building techniques, while incorporating defensive features that enabled religious structures to serve military functions during periods of unrest. The cathedral at Havelberg, reconstructed following the conquest of the region, exemplifies this approach with massive stone walls, sophisticated engineering, and architectural details that demonstrated German technological capabilities while providing secure facilities for religious and administrative activities. Market facilities in colonial towns incorporated advanced commercial infrastructure, including standardized weights and measures, secure storage facilities, and specialized areas for different types of commercial activity that facilitated trade relationships extending throughout northern Europe. Archaeological evidence from market sites reveals the systematic organization of commercial spaces, with designated areas for different types of merchants and craftsmen that maximized both commercial efficiency and administrative oversight of trade activities. Housing construction in colonial settlements reflected both practical adaptation to local environmental conditions and cultural preferences that maintained German architectural traditions while incorporating improvements designed to enhance comfort and functionality. Colonial houses typically featured stone foundations, timber frame superstructures, and specialised interior arrangements that provided superior living conditions compared to traditional Wendish residential construction, while incorporating storage facilities, workshops, and animal housing that supported the mixed agricultural and craft economy characteristic of colonial communities. Linguistic assimilation processes throughout the conquered territories proceeded through systematic policies designed to eliminate Wendish language use, while establishing German as the exclusive medium for all official, commercial, and religious activities. Colonial administrators implemented comprehensive language requirements that prohibited the use of Wendish languages in legal proceedings, commercial transactions, and religious services, while establishing German language schools and requiring German literacy for participation in guild activities and urban governance. Contemporary documents from colonial administrative centres reveal the systematic enforcement of these language policies, with penalties imposed on individuals who continue to use Wendish languages in public contexts and incentives provided to encourage rapid German language acquisition. The gradual decline of Wendish language use in daily life resulted from both official policies and practical considerations that made German language skills essential for economic and social advancement within the colonial system. Archaeological evidence from domestic contexts reveals the progressive disappearance of Wendish language inscriptions on household objects and personal items, replaced by German language markings that indicate the linguistic transformation of even private family life. The persistence of Wendish linguistic elements in place names and specialised vocabulary related to local environmental conditions provides evidence of the gradual nature of this linguistic transformation, with some Wendish terms being incorporated into local German dialects, while the broader Wendish linguistic system disappeared from active use. Religious instruction conducted exclusively in German provided a crucial mechanism for linguistic assimilation, with church services, religious education, and ceremonial activities serving as regular opportunities for Wendish populations to encounter German language use in formal contexts that emphasised its cultural and spiritual authority. The establishment of German language schools throughout the colonial territories ensured that younger generations acquired German literacy and linguistic competence, while having limited exposure to traditional Wendish languages, facilitating the rapid linguistic transformation of colonial populations within a single generation. Commercial activities conducted according to German legal and linguistic standards created powerful economic incentives for Wendish language abandonment, with participation in colonial trade networks requiring German language competence and familiarity with German commercial practices and legal procedures. Archaeological evidence from commercial sites reveals the systematic use of German language documentation for trade transactions, inventory management, and quality control procedures, indicating the complete integration of colonial commercial activities into German language business networks that extended throughout Northern Europe. The systematic German colonisation of Wendish territories proved remarkably successful across most of the conquered regions, yet certain geographical and political circumstances enabled small pockets of Wendish populations to maintain their cultural identity and linguistic traditions despite centuries of assimilationist pressure. The most significant of these surviving communities concentrated in the Lusatian region, where the complex topography of forests, marshlands and river valleys provided natural refuges that German administrative control penetrated slowly and incompletely. The Sorbian populations inhabiting this region, descendants of the original Wendish tribes that had settled along the upper reaches of the Spree and Neisse rivers during the 6th century migrations, managed to preserve essential elements of their ancestral culture through adaptive strategies that balanced accommodation with German political authority against determined resistance to complete cultural assimilation. The geographical concentration of Sorbian populations in Lusatia reflected both historical settlement patterns and the practical limitations of German colonial expansion in regions characterised by difficult terrain and marginal agricultural potential. The extensive forest cover that dominated much of the region had traditionally provided Wendish communities with resources for hunting, gathering, and specialised craft production, while the numerous small rivers and seasonal wetlands created transportation networks that remained under indigenous control despite German political dominance in the major urban centres. Archaeological surveys conducted throughout the Lusatian region have revealed continuous occupation of traditional Wendish settlement sites from the medieval period through early modern times, with material culture assemblages showing gradual adaptation to German political requirements while maintaining distinctively Slavic characteristics in domestic contexts and religious practices. The survival of Sorbian communities required sophisticated strategies for navigating the complex political landscape created by German conquest and colonisation, with community leaders developing diplomatic approaches that acknowledged German political authority while preserving maximum autonomy in cultural and religious matters. The establishment of tributary relationships with German noble families provided Sorbian communities with protection from the most aggressive colonisation policies, while creating obligations that could be fulfilled through traditional economic activities rather than requiring fundamental changes in social organisation or cultural practices. Contemporary documents from the archives of German monasteries and noble households reveal numerous agreements between Sorbian community leaders and German authorities that specified tribute payments in forest products, craft goods, and agricultural surplus, while explicitly guaranteeing the preservation of traditional land use rights and community governance structures. The development of distinct Upper and Lower Sorbian cultural traditions during the medieval period reflected both geographical separation and different patterns of interaction with German colonial administration, with communities in the northern regions experiencing more intensive German settlement pressure, while southern populations maintained greater isolation and cultural autonomy. Upper Sorbian communities, concentrated around the emerging German administrative centre at Bautzen, developed cultural practices that incorporated selective German influences while preserving core elements of traditional Wendish social organisation, religious beliefs, and artistic traditions. Archaeological evidence from Upper Sorbian settlements reveals material culture assemblages that combine traditional Slavic ceramic forms and decorative motifs with German-influenced metalwork and architectural elements, indicating cultural synthesis rather than simple assimilation or resistance. Lower Sorbian populations, inhabiting the more remote forest and marshland regions north of the Spree River, maintained cultural practices that showed less German influence and preserved more archaic elements of traditional Wendish civilization. The relative isolation of these communities from major German trade routes and administrative centres enabled the continuation of traditional subsistence practices, seasonal migration patterns, and religious observances that had largely disappeared from regions experiencing intensive German colonisation. Ethnographic studies conducted during the early modern period documented Lower Sorbian cultural practices that preserved elements of pre-Christian religious traditions, including seasonal festivals, divination practices, and folk medical techniques that demonstrated remarkable continuity with archaeological evidence from medieval Wendish sites throughout Central Europe. The linguistic evolution of Sorbian languages during the medieval and early modern periods provides crucial evidence for understanding the processes through which minority populations maintained cultural identity under conditions of political subordination and demographic pressure from dominant populations. Upper Sorbian developed along different trajectories than Lower Sorbian, with greater incorporation of German loanwords and grammatical influences that reflected more intensive contact with German-speaking populations, while Lower Sorbian preserved more archaic phonological and morphological features that linked it directly to the broader West Slavic linguistic family. Comparative linguistic analysis reveals that both Sorbian languages maintained essential grammatical structures and core vocabulary that distinguished them clearly from German, while developing specialized terminology for describing local environmental conditions and cultural practices that had no equivalent in German linguistic traditions. The preservation of Sorbian oral traditions played a crucial role in maintaining cultural continuity across generations that experienced varying degrees of pressure to assimilate into German cultural norms, with traditional songs, stories, and ceremonial texts serving as repositories for historical memory and cultural knowledge that could not be preserved through written documentation. The complexity and sophistication of Sorbian oral literature, documented through systematic collection efforts beginning in the 18th century, demonstrates the existence of highly developed cultural institutions that maintain traditional knowledge systems despite centuries of political marginalization and cultural suppression. Traditional Sorbian epic songs preserve detailed historical narratives describing the original Wendish migrations, the establishment of tribal territories, conflicts with German expansion, and the heroic resistance of legendary leaders whose exploits provided models for cultural persistence under adverse conditions. Folk songs and ceremonial chants preserved in Sorbian oral tradition maintained sophisticated poetic structures and musical forms that demonstrated continuity with broader Slavic cultural traditions, while developing distinctive regional characteristics that reflected local historical experiences and environmental conditions. the seasonal song cycles associated with agricultural activities and religious festivals preserved detailed knowledge of traditional farming practices, astronomical observations, and ritual procedures that enabled Sorbian communities to maintain cultural practices that had been abandoned in regions experiencing complete German assimilation. Archaeological investigations at sites associated with traditional Sorbian seasonal gatherings have uncovered evidence of continuous ritual use spanning centuries, with artifact deposits that confirm the persistence of traditional ceremonial practices despite official prohibition and German administrative oversight. The role of religious institutions in preserving Sorbian cultural traditions evolved dramatically following the Protestant Reformation, which created new opportunities for indigenous language use and cultural expression within officially sanctioned religious contexts. Prior to the Reformation, the Catholic Church had generally supported German cultural assimilation policies that discouraged the use of indigenous languages in religious contexts, and promoted the adoption of German cultural practices as evidence of Christian devotion and social advancement. The establishment of Protestant churches in Sorbian regions during the 16th century created unprecedented opportunities for religious instruction and ceremonial activities conducted in Sorbian languages, with Protestant emphasis on vernacular religious education, providing official justification for the preservation and development of Sorbian literacy and literary traditions. Lutheran ministers serving Sorbian communities faced the practical necessity of conducting religious services and providing religious instruction in languages that their congregations could understand, leading to systematic efforts to develop Sorbian language religious literature and establish educational programs that promoted Sorbian literacy alongside German language acquisition. The translation of religious texts into Sorbian languages required the development of standardized writing systems and grammatical conventions that provided the foundation for later literary development, while creating permanent written records of Sorbian linguistic and cultural traditions that had previously existed only in oral form. The earliest printed books in Sorbian languages, produced during the late 16th and early 17th centuries, included catechisms, prayer books, and hymn collections that served both religious and cultural preservation functions by providing Sorbian communities with access to their ancestral languages in prestigious written forms. The establishment of Sorbian language schools in connection with Protestant churches created systematic educational opportunities that enabled younger generations to acquire literacy in their ancestral languages while meeting German administrative requirements for basic education and religious instruction. These educational programs typically combined Sorbian language instruction in religious subjects with German language instruction in practical skills and administrative procedures, creating bilingual educational experiences that prepared Sorbian youth for participation in German-dominated economic and political systems, while preserving their cultural and linguistic heritage. Contemporary school records from Sorbian communities reveal educational curricula that included traditional Sorbian songs and stories alongside standard religious and academic subjects, indicating systematic efforts to integrate cultural preservation into officially sanctioned educational activities. Catholic regions of Sorbian territory experienced different patterns of cultural preservation that reflected the particular characteristics of Catholic institutional structure and theological emphasis, with Catholic clergy often serving as crucial intermediaries between Sorbian communities and German administrative authorities. Catholic priests serving Sorbian parishes frequently possessed extensive knowledge of local cultural traditions and linguistic practices, enabling them to provide religious instruction that incorporated traditional cultural elements while maintaining theological orthodoxy and political loyalty to German ecclesiastical and secular authorities. The Catholic emphasis on ritual continuity and traditional ceremonial forms provided opportunities for the preservation of Sorbian cultural practices within officially sanctioned religious contexts, with traditional seasonal festivals and ceremonial observances being adapted to Christian theological frameworks rather than being completely eliminated. The production of Catholic religious literature in Sorbian languages proceeded more slowly than Protestant publishing efforts, but ultimately produced works of considerable literary and cultural significance that preserved traditional linguistic forms and cultural concepts within Christian theological contexts. Catholic catechisms and devotional works translated into Sorbian languages during the 17th and 18th centuries incorporated traditional poetic forms and rhetorical structures that maintained continuity with pre-Christian oral traditions while adapting their content to Christian theological requirements. The preservation of traditional Sorbian ceremonial music within Catholic liturgical contexts enabled the continuation of sophisticated musical traditions that might otherwise have disappeared under German cultural pressure, with traditional melodies and rhythmic patterns being adapted for use in religious services while maintaining their distinctive Sorbian characteristics. Economic activities within Sorbian communities evolved to accommodate German political and administrative requirements, while preserving traditional subsistence practices and craft production techniques that maintained cultural distinctiveness and provided economic foundations for community autonomy. Traditional Sorbian agricultural practices, adapted to the specific environmental conditions of the Lusatian region, continue to provide the economic foundation for community life despite German efforts to promote the adoption of more intensive farming methods and commercial crop production. Archaeological investigations at Sorbian agricultural sites have revealed the persistence of traditional field systems, crop varieties and farming techniques that maximize productivity from marginal soils and variable climatic conditions, while maintaining ecological sustainability and community food security. Forest exploitation remained a crucial component of Sorbian economic life throughout the medieval and early modern periods, with traditional knowledge of woodland management and forest product processing providing Sorbian communities with economic resources that were highly valued in German markets, while requiring minimal adaptation to German commercial practices. Sorbian communities developed sophisticated techniques for sustainable timber harvesting, charcoal production, and the gathering of forest products including medicinal plants, dyes, and craft materials that enabled them to participate in regional economic networks while maintaining traditional relationships with forest ecosystems. Contemporary administrative records document the systematic exploitation of Sorbian forest knowledge by German authorities, who relied on indigenous expertise for managing woodland resources and developing forest-based industries that became crucial components of regional economic development. Craft production within Sorbian communities preserved traditional techniques and artistic traditions that maintained cultural distinctiveness while producing goods that were competitive in German markets and met the material needs of Sorbian households. Traditional Sorbian pottery production continued throughout the medieval period, using techniques and decorative motifs that preserved pre-Christian symbolic systems while adapting to changing functional requirements and aesthetic preferences. Archaeological assemblages from Sorbian craft sites reveal the persistence of traditional ceramic forms and decorative techniques, alongside the adoption of new technologies and production methods that enhance productivity and product quality without compromising cultural authenticity. Textile production in Sorbian communities maintained traditional techniques for processing flax and wool, while developing distinctive decorative traditions that incorporated both pre-Christian symbolic motifs and Christian religious imagery. Traditional Sorbian costume elements preserved through museum collections and ethnographic documentation demonstrate the persistence of sophisticated textile arts that maintained cultural identity through distinctive colour combinations, decorative patterns, and garment forms that clearly distinguish Sorbian communities from surrounding German populations. The production of traditional textiles required specialised knowledge of dye plants, fibre processing techniques, and weaving methods that was transmitted through family networks and community institutions that preserved technical expertise across generations. Metalworking traditions within Sorbian communities adapted traditional techniques to produce both utilitarian objects for community use and decorative items that maintained cultural symbolism while meeting changing functional requirements. Archaeological investigations at Sorbian metalworking sites have uncovered evidence of continuous production spanning centuries, with artifact assemblages that demonstrate the persistence of traditional decorative motifs and production techniques, alongside the adoption of new tools and methods that enhance technical capabilities. Traditional Sorbian metalwork incorporated symbolic elements derived from pre-Christian religious traditions, with decorative patterns and ritual objects that preserved ancient cultural meanings within contexts that were acceptable to German administrative and religious authorities. Social organisation within Sorbian communities evolved to balance traditional kinship structures and community governance systems with the requirements of German administrative oversight and legal jurisdiction. Traditional Sorbian extended family systems continued to provide the foundation for community organisation and resource management, with kinship networks serving crucial functions in maintaining cultural transmission, economic cooperation, and mutual support that enabled community survival under conditions of political subordination. Community leadership structures adapted to German administrative requirements while preserving traditional decision-making processes and conflict resolution mechanisms that maintained social cohesion and cultural continuity. Marriage practices within Sorbian communities preserved traditional customs and ceremonial elements that maintained cultural identity while accommodating German legal requirements and religious oversight. Traditional Sorbian wedding ceremonies incorporated elaborate ritual sequences, ceremonial foods, and symbolic objects that preserved ancient cultural meanings while adapting to Christian theological frameworks and German legal procedures. The preservation of traditional marriage customs required careful negotiation between community desires to maintain cultural authenticity and external pressures to conform to German social norms and religious requirements. Seasonal festivals and ceremonial observances provided crucial opportunities for Sorbian communities to maintain cultural traditions and strengthen social bonds that supported community resilience under conditions of external pressure and cultural marginalization. Traditional seasonal celebrations were adapted to Christian calendar systems while preserving essential ritual elements and symbolic meanings that connected contemporary communities with ancestral cultural traditions. Archaeological evidence from sites associated with traditional Sorbian festivals reveals continuous use spanning centuries, with artifact deposits that confirm the persistence of traditional ceremonial practices despite changing political and religious circumstances. The development of Sorbian cultural institutions during the early modern period created organisational frameworks that enabled systematic cultural preservation efforts while maintaining acceptable relationships with German administrative and religious authorities. Community organisations focused on cultural preservation activities, including the collection and documentation of traditional songs, stories and customs that might otherwise have been lost to assimilationist pressures and generational change. These cultural preservation efforts required careful balance between maintaining cultural authenticity and avoiding activities that might be interpreted as political resistance or religious heterodoxy by German authorities, who remained suspicious of indigenous cultural practices that they could not fully understand or control. The systematic incorporation of former Wendish territories into the Holy Roman Empire's administrative framework required the development of entirely new governmental structures that could effectively manage vast regions populated by diverse ethnic groups while maintaining imperial authority and extracting sufficient revenues to support ongoing military operations and administrative expenses. The establishment of the Margraviate of Brandenburg in 1157 under Albert the Bear represented the first comprehensive attempt to create stable administrative institutions capable of governing conquered Wendish lands according to German legal principles while accommodating the practical realities of ruling populations that retained distinct cultural practices and economic systems. The Margraviat's territorial boundaries encompassed the traditional lands of the Haveli and portions of Lutici territory, creating an administrative unit that controlled crucial river crossings along the Havel and Spree while providing strategic depth for defending established German territories against potential resurgence of Wendish resistance. The administrative structure developed for Brandenburg incorporated elements of both traditional German feudal organisation and innovative approaches designed specifically for frontier conditions where imperial authority remained contested and military considerations took precedence over purely civilian governance. Albert the Bear established his primary administrative centre at the fortress of Brandenburg, which underwent extensive reconstruction to serve as both military stronghold and administrative headquarters, capable of housing the complex bureaucratic apparatus required for territorial governance. Archaeological investigations at the site have revealed the construction of specialised buildings, including archives, treasuries, courts, and residential quarters for administrative personnel, with architectural features that demonstrated the permanence and sophistication of German administrative presence while providing defensive capabilities necessary for frontier conditions. The Margravial administration implemented systematic record-keeping procedures that documented land grants, tax assessments, legal proceedings, and military obligations with unprecedented thoroughness compared to earlier German administrative practices in frontier regions. Contemporary documents from the Brandenburg archives reveal detailed inventories of territorial resources, population assessments, and revenue calculations that enabled systematic exploitation of conquered territories while providing the information necessary for effective military planning and resource allocation. The administrative staff required for maintaining these records included trained clerks, legal specialists, and financial administrators recruited from established German territories, creating a professional bureaucratic class that served as the backbone of imperial administration in the conquered regions. Land tenure arrangements in the Margraviate reflected the complex balance between rewarding German colonists and military supporters, while maintaining sufficient imperial control over territorial resources to prevent the emergence of autonomous noble power that might challenge Margravial authority. The implementation of feudal land grants followed established German legal precedents, while adapting to local conditions that included the presence of surviving Wendish populations whose traditional land use rights required careful management to prevent rebellion while extracting maximum economic benefit from territorial resources. Archaeological evidence from rural sites throughout Brandenburg reveals the systematic establishment of German manor houses and administrative centres that supervised agricultural production while maintaining military capabilities necessary for local defence and population control. The legal status of remaining Wendish populations within the Margraviate created complex administrative challenges that required the development of new legal categories and procedures that could accommodate indigenous customary practices within German legal frameworks, while ensuring imperial authority over all territorial inhabitants. Wendish communities that had submitted peacefully to German conquest retained certain traditional rights, including continued occupation of ancestral lands and participation in local governance structures, provided these arrangements did not conflict with German administrative requirements or military necessities. Contemporary legal documents reveal the systematic codification of these arrangements through formal agreements that specified Wendish obligations, including tribute payments, military service, and participation in imperial legal proceedings, while guaranteeing protection of traditional cultural and religious practices that posed no threat to German political authority. The development of German legal institutions throughout former Wendish territories required extensive adaptation of established legal procedures to address the unique circumstances created by conquest and colonization, with particular attention to property rights, commercial regulations, and criminal justice procedures that could effectively govern ethnically diverse populations. The establishment of German courts in major administrative centres provided formal legal venues for resolving disputes involving both German and Wendish populations, with legal procedures that incorporated elements of traditional Wendish customary law, while maintaining the supremacy of German legal principles and imperial administrative authority. Archaeological investigations at court sites have uncovered evidence of sophisticated legal infrastructure, including specialized buildings for legal proceedings, secure facilities for document storage, and residential quarters for legal personnel that demonstrate the systematic establishment of German legal institutions throughout the conquered territories. Commercial law development in the Margraviate reflected the need to integrate conquered territories into broader European trade networks, while accommodating traditional Wendish economic practices and ensuring imperial control over lucrative commercial activities. The implementation of standardized weights, measures, and currency systems facilitated trade relationships with established German commercial centres, while providing mechanisms for imperial taxation of commercial transactions and regulation of market activities. Contemporary commercial documents reveal the systematic establishment of market privileges, guild regulations, and trade agreements that promoted economic development while ensuring German administrative oversight of all significant commercial activities within the Margraviate. The Duchy of Saxony underwent parallel administrative development under Henry the Lion, whose territorial acquisitions in former Oberdreich lands required the establishment of administrative institutions capable of governing coastal regions with distinct geographical and economic characteristics compared to traditional Saxon territories. The duchy's administrative structure incorporated maritime elements that reflected the importance of Baltic trade and naval operations in maintaining control over coastal Wendish populations, with specialised administrative positions responsible for harbour management, naval logistics, and maritime commercial regulation. Archaeological evidence from Saxon administrative centres along the Baltic coast reveals the construction of harbour facilities, naval bases, and commercial infrastructure that supported both military operations and economic exploitation of maritime resources. Henry the Lion's administrative innovations included the systematic establishment of German urban centres throughout conquered Oberdreich territories, with carefully planned settlements that incorporated advanced infrastructure and defensive capabilities while serving as focal points for German cultural influence and administrative control. The city of Lübeck, established around 1158 on the site of the former Wendish settlement of Lübitz, exemplifies this approach with its systematic urban planning that incorporated German architectural styles, legal institutions, and commercial facilities while eliminating virtually all traces of previous Wendish occupation. Archaeological investigations at Lübeck have revealed extensive evidence of deliberate demolition of Wendish structures and their replacement with German buildings that followed standardized architectural plans and construction techniques imported from established German urban centres. The economic integration of former Wendish territories into imperial administrative systems required fundamental changes in agricultural production, resource extraction, and commercial organisation that transformed traditional subsistence economies into market-oriented systems capable of generating the surpluses necessary to support imperial administrative expenses and military operations. The implementation of German agricultural techniques throughout conquered territories increased productivity while creating new forms of economic organisation that tied rural populations more closely to imperial administrative structures through tax obligations, feudal services, and market relationships that replaced traditional Wendish economic autonomy with systematic integration into German economic systems. Agricultural intensification programs implemented throughout former Wendish territories involved the systematic introduction of improved farming techniques, new crop varieties, and enhanced livestock breeds that dramatically increased agricultural productivity while requiring fundamental changes in land use patterns and labour organisation. The establishment of German manor houses throughout rural areas provided the administrative infrastructure necessary for supervising agricultural improvements, while maintaining political control over rural populations through direct oversight of farming activities and systematic collection of agricultural surpluses. Archaeological surveys in agricultural regions have revealed extensive evidence of field system reorganisation, drainage improvements, and infrastructure development that demonstrate the comprehensive nature of agricultural transformation under German administration. The development of mining operations in regions with mineral resources created new economic opportunities while requiring specialised administrative structures capable of managing complex extraction operations and ensuring imperial control over valuable mineral resources. The silver mines at Freiberg, developed during the late 12th century in former Sorbian territory, became crucial sources of imperial revenue while requiring the establishment of specialised mining communities with unique legal privileges and administrative arrangements that balanced the need for skilled labour with imperial requirements for resource control and revenue extraction. Archaeological investigations at mining sites have revealed sophisticated extraction techniques, processing facilities, and residential complexes that demonstrate the rapid development of advanced mining operations under German administrative oversight. Forest resources throughout former Wendish territories provided crucial materials for construction, fuel, and craft production while requiring systematic management to ensure sustainable exploitation and prevent unauthorized use by local populations. The establishment of imperial forest administration created specialized bureaucratic positions responsible for managing woodland resources, supervising timber harvesting, and regulating hunting activities that had traditionally provided important supplements to local subsistence economies. Contemporary administrative documents reveal detailed forest management procedures that balanced economic exploitation with conservation requirements, while maintaining strict imperial control over access to forest resources that had previously been freely available to Wendish communities. Commercial integration of former Wendish territories into broader European trade networks required the development of transportation infrastructure, market facilities, and commercial regulations that could accommodate increased trade volumes, while ensuring imperial taxation of commercial activities and regulation of merchant operations. The systematic improvement of road networks throughout conquered territories facilitated the movement of goods and administrative personnel while providing strategic advantages for military operations and communication between administrative centres. Archaeological evidence from roadway sites reveals extensive construction projects that created permanent transportation infrastructure using advanced engineering techniques and substantial labour investments that demonstrate imperial commitment to long-term territorial integration. River transportation systems throughout former Wendish territories underwent systematic development to support increased commercial activity and administrative communication, with improvements to harbours, navigation channels, and cargo handling facilities that accommodated larger vessels and higher traffic volumes than traditional Wendish river transport had required. The establishment of toll stations and customs facilities along major waterways provided mechanisms for imperial taxation of commercial transport, while regulating the movement of goods and people through systematic inspection and documentation procedures. Contemporary customs records reveal the systematic monitoring of commercial traffic and the collection of substantial revenues from transportation taxes that contributed significantly to imperial administrative expenses. Market development in newly established German towns created focal points for commercial activity that integrated local agricultural production with long-distance trade networks, while providing venues for craft production and commercial services that supported growing urban populations. The establishment of market privileges and guild regulations created legal frameworks for commercial activity that promoted economic development while ensuring German administrative control over all significant commercial operations within imperial territories. Archaeological investigations at market sites have revealed sophisticated commercial infrastructure, including permanent stalls, storage facilities, and specialised areas for different types of commercial activity that demonstrate the rapid establishment of advanced commercial institutions under German administration. participation in Hanseatic trade networks provided former Wendish territories with access to broader European commercial systems while requiring adaptation to standardised commercial practices and legal procedures that integrated local economic activities into international trade relationships. The incorporation of Baltic ports in former Wendish territories into Hanseatic commercial networks created opportunities for economic development and cultural exchange, while ensuring German administrative oversight of international commercial activities and systematic collection of customs revenues from foreign trade. Contemporary Hanseatic records document the systematic expansion of trade relationships to include former Wendish territories, with standardised commercial procedures and legal arrangements that facilitated international commerce while maintaining German political control over commercial activities. Craft production throughout former Wendish territories experienced systematic development under German administrative oversight, with the establishment of guild organisations and specialised workshops that improved product quality while creating new economic opportunities for both German colonists and surviving Wendish populations. The implementation of guild regulations and quality control standards elevated craft production to levels that could compete in broader European markets, while providing mechanisms for imperial taxation of craft activities and regulation of artisan training and commercial operations. Archaeological evidence from craft sites reveals the systematic establishment of specialised workshops with advanced tools and production techniques that demonstrate significant improvements in craft capabilities under German administrative development. Urban development throughout former Wendish territories followed systematic planning principles that incorporated defensive considerations, commercial requirements, and administrative necessities, while demonstrating German cultural superiority through architectural styles and urban layouts that contrasted sharply with traditional Wendish settlement patterns. The establishment of standardised building codes and urban planning regulations created uniform development standards that promoted efficient urban growth, while ensuring German administrative oversight of all construction activities and urban development projects. Archaeological investigations at urban sites reveal comprehensive planning efforts that created permanent urban infrastructure capable of supporting substantial populations, while providing defensive capabilities and administrative facilities necessary for imperial territorial control. Religious institutions throughout former Wendish territories served crucial administrative functions beyond their spiritual roles, with churches and monasteries providing educational services, record-keeping facilities, and communication networks that supported imperial administrative operations, while promoting German cultural assimilation among conquered populations. The systematic establishment of German religious institutions created permanent cultural influence that reinforced imperial political authority, while providing practical administrative services that were essential for effective territorial governance. Contemporary religious records document the systematic expansion of German religious institutions throughout conquered territories, with standardised organisational structures and administrative procedures that integrated religious activities into broader imperial administrative systems. Educational institutions established in connection with religious organisations provided systematic instruction in German language and culture, while training administrative personnel and skilled craftsmen necessary for territorial development and effective governance. The establishment of schools and training programs created opportunities for both German colonists and surviving Wendish populations to acquire skills necessary for participation in imperial administrative and economic systems, while promoting cultural assimilation and political loyalty to German imperial authority. Archaeological evidence from educational sites reveals the construction of specialised facilities for instruction and training that demonstrate systematic investment in human resource development necessary for long-term territorial integration and administrative effectiveness. The transformation of European religious and intellectual life during the 16th century created unprecedented opportunities for Sorbian communities to develop literary traditions and educational institutions that preserve their ancestral languages while adapting to the theological and political changes sweeping through Central Europe. The Protestant Reformation, initiated by Martin Luther's challenge to papal authority in 1517, fundamentally altered the relationship between religious institutions and vernacular languages throughout the Holy Roman Empire, creating conditions that enabled Sorbian-speaking populations to develop written literary traditions that had been impossible under the previous Catholic monopoly on religious education and liturgical practice. Lutheran theological emphasis on vernacular religious instruction provided the crucial justification for developing Sorbian language religious literature, with Protestant reformers arguing that effective Christian education required the use of languages that congregations could understand, rather than the Latin that had dominated Catholic religious practice. This theological innovation created immediate practical necessities for Protestant ministers serving Sorbian communities, who found themselves compelled to develop Sorbian language translations of essential religious texts, including catechisms, prayer books, and biblical passages that could serve the spiritual needs of populations who possessed limited German language competence despite centuries of political subordination to German administrative authority. The earliest systematic efforts to create written Sorbian literature began around 1548, when Miklaus Jakubica, a Lutheran pastor serving communities in the Bautzen region, undertook the translation of basic religious texts into Upper Sorbian using orthographic conventions that he developed through careful analysis of spoken Sorbian phonology and comparison with established German and Latin writing systems. Jakubica's translation work required the resolution of complex linguistic challenges, including the representation of Sorbian phonemes that had no equivalent in German orthographic tradition, the standardization of grammatical forms that varied among different Sorbian communities, and the development of religious vocabulary that could accurately convey Protestant theological concepts while maintaining accessibility to Sorbian speakers with varying levels of formal education. The production of the first printed Sorbian catechism in 1574 represented a watershed moment in the development of Sorbian literary culture, providing Sorbian communities with access to their ancestral language in the prestigious medium of print, while establishing orthographic and grammatical standards that would influence Sorbian literary development for centuries. The catechism, produced by the printing house of Lorenz Berwalder in Bautzen, required the creation of specialized type fonts that could accommodate Sorbian diacritical marks and letter combinations, with printing techniques that demonstrated the technical sophistication necessary for producing high-quality vernacular religious literature. Archaeological investigations at the Berwalder printing house site have uncovered evidence of specialized equipment and materials imported from major German printing centers, indicating the substantial investment required for establishing Sorbian language publishing capabilities. Lower Sorbian literary development followed a parallel trajectory under the leadership of Albin Moller, whose translation of the New Testament into Lower Sorbian during the 1580s created the foundation for Lower Sorbian written literature, while addressing the distinct linguistic characteristics that differentiated Lower Sorbian from its Upper Sorbian counterpart. Moller's translation work required extensive consultation with Lower Sorbian communities to ensure linguistic accuracy and theological comprehensibility, with manuscript evidence revealing multiple revision cycles that incorporated feedback from Sorbian speakers across the diverse dialectal regions, where Lower Sorbian remained the primary language of daily communication. The development of Sorbian hymn traditions during the late 16th and early 17th centuries created opportunities for preserving traditional Sorbian musical forms within Protestant liturgical contexts while adapting ancient melodies and poetic structures to Christian theological content. Traditional Sorbian folk songs provided the musical foundation for many early Protestant hymns, with composers like Jurij Haustin Svetlik adapting pre-Christian ceremonial music and seasonal songs to create distinctively Sorbian Protestant musical traditions that maintained cultural authenticity while meeting religious requirements for doctrinal orthodoxy and liturgical appropriateness. The establishment of Sorbian language schools in connection with Protestant churches created systematic educational opportunities that enabled Sorbian children to acquire literacy in their ancestral language while receiving religious instruction and basic academic training that prepared them for participation in German-dominated economic and administrative systems. Educational curricula developed for these schools typically included Sorbian language instruction in religious subjects, German language instruction in practical skills and administrative procedures, and Latin instruction for students preparing for advanced religious or academic careers. Contemporary school records reveal educational approaches that balance cultural preservation with practical preparation for life in German-dominated society, with instructional methods that use Sorbian cultural materials, including traditional songs, stories, and historical narratives, to reinforce religious and academic lessons. Catholic responses to Protestant educational initiatives included the development of Catholic Sorbian language religious literature and educational programs designed to maintain Catholic loyalty among Sorbian populations, while competing with Protestant efforts to win Sorbian religious allegiance through vernacular religious instruction. The Jesuit order played a particularly crucial role in Catholic Sorbian educational development, with Jesuit schools in Sorbian regions implementing sophisticated educational programs that combined rigorous academic instruction with intensive religious training conducted partially in Sorbian languages to ensure theological comprehension and cultural relevance. The production of Catholic Sorbian religious literature required different approaches than Protestant publishing efforts, with Catholic theological emphasis on traditional authority and liturgical continuity, creating constraints on vernacular religious expression that Protestant theology did not impose. Catholic Sorbian translations typically maintained closer adherence to Latin theological terminology and liturgical formulations, with translation techniques that prioritized theological precision over linguistic accessibility, while preserving essential Catholic doctrinal distinctions that Protestant translations might obscure or eliminate. Economic changes during the early modern period created new opportunities and challenges for Sorbian communities as expanding trade networks and developing manufacturing industries altered traditional economic relationships while creating demands for specialized skills and commercial participation that required adaptation to German-dominated economic systems. The growth of textile manufacturing in Lusatian towns provided employment opportunities for Sorbian populations while requiring the acquisition of new technical skills and adaptation to industrial work patterns that differed significantly from traditional agricultural and craft production methods. The development of linen production as a major industry in Sorbian regions during the 16th and 17th centuries created economic opportunities that built upon traditional Sorbian expertise in flax cultivation and textile production, while requiring adaptation to commercial production methods and market relationships that integrated Sorbian communities into broader European economic networks. Archaeological evidence from textile production sites reveals the systematic establishment of specialized workshops with advanced looms and processing equipment that enabled Sorbian textile producers to manufacture high-quality products for export markets, while maintaining traditional techniques and artistic traditions that preserved cultural distinctiveness. Forest industries throughout Sorbian territories experienced significant expansion during this period, as growing demand for timber, charcoal and forest products created new economic opportunities while requiring systematic forest management and commercial organization that balanced traditional Sorbian woodland knowledge with German administrative oversight and market requirements. The development of glass manufacturing in forested regions provided particularly important economic opportunities for Sorbian communities, with glassmaking techniques that combined traditional knowledge of forest resources with advanced manufacturing methods imported from established German and Bohemian glass production centres. Agricultural intensification in Sorbian regions during the early modern period involved the systematic introduction of new crop varieties and farming techniques that increased productivity while requiring a adaptation of traditional agricultural practices to accommodate changing market demands and administrative requirements. The cultivation of hops for beer production became particularly important in some Sorbian regions, with hop cultivation techniques that utilised traditional Sorbian agricultural knowledge while producing crops for commercial markets that extended throughout Central Europe. Social changes within Sorbian communities during this period reflected the complex balance between maintaining traditional social structures and adapting to changing economic and political circumstances that create new opportunities for social advancement, while potentially threatening traditional community cohesion and cultural continuity. The emergence of a Sorbian educated class through Protestant and Catholic educational programs created new forms of community leadership while potentially creating social divisions between educated individuals who could participate effectively in German-dominated institutions and traditional community members whose opportunities remained limited by language barriers and cultural differences. Marriage patterns within Sorbian communities evolved during this period as increased contact with German populations and changing economic opportunities created new possibilities for intermarriage while potentially threatening the demographic foundations of Sorbian cultural continuity. Community responses to these challenges included the development of cultural institutions and social practices designed to maintain Sorbian identity while accommodating the practical necessities of life in German-dominated society, with marriage customs and family practices that preserved essential cultural elements while adapting to changing social and economic circumstances. Religious practices within Sorbian communities underwent significant transformation as Protestant and Catholic Reformation efforts created new forms of religious expression, while traditional pre-Christian practices continued to influence popular religious culture despite official prohibition and clerical opposition. The adaptation of traditional seasonal festivals to Christian calendar systems created syncretic religious practices that preserved ancient cultural meanings while maintaining acceptable relationships with religious authorities who remained suspicious of indigenous practices that they could not fully understand or control. The development of Sorbian religious art and architecture during this period reflected the complex interaction between traditional cultural forms and Christian theological requirements, with church decorations and religious objects that incorporated traditional Sorbian artistic motifs, while maintaining doctrinal orthodoxy and aesthetic standards acceptable to German religious authorities. Archaeological investigations at Sorbian churches have revealed artistic programs that demonstrate sophisticated synthesis of cultural traditions, with decorative elements that preserve traditional symbolic meanings while adapting to Christian iconographic requirements and German artistic influences. Legal status developments for Sorbian communities during the early modern period reflected changing administrative approaches that recognized the practical necessity of accommodating indigenous populations while maintaining German political authority and administrative control. Legal reforms implemented during this period typically expanded Sorbian participation in local governance while maintaining German oversight of all significant political and administrative decisions, with legal arrangements that balance community autonomy with imperial administrative requirements. The preservation of Sorbian customary law within German legal frameworks required systematic codification efforts that documented traditional legal practices while adapting them to German legal principles and administrative procedures. Contemporary legal documents reveal complex negotiations between Sorbian community leaders and German administrative authorities that resulted in formal recognition of certain traditional legal practices while ensuring their subordination to German legal authority and imperial administrative oversight. Demographic changes in Sorbian regions during this period reflected both natural population growth and continued German immigration that altered the ethnic composition of traditional Sorbian territories while creating new forms of cultural interaction and potential conflict. Population records from this period indicate significant variation in demographic patterns among different Sorbian regions, with some areas experiencing substantial German immigration, while others maintained predominantly Sorbian populations that preserved traditional cultural practices with minimal external interference. The impact of military conflicts during the early modern period, including the 30 Years' War, created severe challenges for Sorbian communities while potentially creating opportunities for cultural preservation through the disruption of German administrative control and the temporary weakening of assimilationist pressures. Military occupation and warfare during this period typically resulted in population displacement, economic disruption, and administrative breakdown that could either threaten community survival or provide opportunities for cultural revival, depending on specific local circumstances and the particular characteristics of military occupation. The devastation wrought by the 30 Years' War fundamentally transformed the demographic and cultural landscape of Sorbian territories, creating both catastrophic disruptions, traditional community structures, and unexpected opportunities for cultural preservation as German administrative control weakened throughout the conflict period. The initial Swedish invasion of Lusatia in 1631 under Gustav II Adolf resulted in the systematic destruction of German administrative centres, while Sorbian rural communities, accustomed to subsistence agriculture and forest refuge strategies, proved remarkably resilient to military occupation and resource extraction. Contemporary Swedish military records describe encounters with Sorbian populations who demonstrated sophisticated knowledge of forest hiding places and seasonal resource management that enabled community survival despite the collapse of formal administrative structures and the widespread destruction of agricultural infrastructure. The withdrawal of Swedish forces in 1635 left vast regions of traditional Sorbian territory effectively ungoverned, with German administrative personnel having fled or perished during the occupation, while local Sorbian communities maintained social organisation through traditional kinship networks and religious institutions that had preserved community cohesion throughout the military crisis. Archaeological evidence from sites like Kamenz and Hoyerswerda reveals extensive destruction layers from the 1630s, followed by reconstruction phases that utilised traditional Sorbian building techniques and settlement patterns, rather than the German architectural forms that had been imposed during the previous century of colonial administration. The reconstruction efforts demonstrate remarkable community resilience and cultural continuity, with traditional Sorbian extended family compounds and agricultural arrangements being restored even in areas that had experienced intensive German colonisation before the war. The gradual restoration of Saxon administrative control during the 1640s encountered Sorbian communities that had effectively reverted to traditional social and economic organisation during the period of administrative collapse, creating complex challenges for German authorities attempting to re-establish colonial administrative structures while managing populations that had demonstrated their capacity for autonomous governance. The compromise arrangements negotiated during this period typically recognised traditional Sorbian community leadership while requiring formal acknowledgement of Saxon political authority, with administrative agreements that preserved significant community autonomy in exchange for tribute payments and military service obligations that could be fulfilled through traditional economic activities rather than requiring fundamental changes in social organisation. The emergence of Ernst Gottlob Hauptmann as a pivotal figure in Sorbian cultural preservation during the late 17th century marked the beginning of systematic scholarly efforts to document and preserve Sorbian linguistic and cultural traditions through academic research methods that combine traditional community knowledge with emerging European scholarly techniques. Hauptmann's linguistic studies, conducted primarily in the Bautzen region during the 1690s, produced the first comprehensive grammatical analysis of Upper Sorbian that established standardized orthographic conventions while documenting dialectal variations and historical linguistic development that connected contemporary Sorbian to broader Slavic linguistic traditions. His manuscript collections, preserved in the Saxon State Library, include detailed documentation of traditional Sorbian folk songs, ceremonial practices, and oral historical narratives that provide crucial evidence for understanding pre-Christian cultural traditions and their persistence through centuries of German political domination. The parallel scholarly work conducted by Jurij Haustin Svetlik in Lower Sorbian regions during the early 18th century complemented Hauptmann's Upper Sorbian research, while addressing the distinct linguistic and cultural characteristics that differentiated Lower Sorbian communities from their southern counterparts. Svetlik's translation projects, including his 1706 Lower Sorbian version of the complete Bible, required extensive linguistic research and community consultation that produced detailed documentation of Lower Sorbian vocabulary, grammatical structures, and cultural concepts that had no equivalent in German linguistic traditions. The printing of Svetlik's biblical translation by the Cottbus printing house of Johann Christoph Zimmermann represented a significant technological achievement that required the development of specialized type fonts and printing techniques capable of accurately reproducing Lower Sorbian orthographic conventions. The establishment of the Sorbian Seminary in Prague during 1728 created the first systematic institutional framework for training Sorbian clergy and educators, with academic programs that combined traditional Catholic theological instruction with specialized training in Sorbian languages, literature, and cultural traditions. The seminary's curriculum included advanced courses in Sorbian linguistics, comparative Slavic studies, and traditional cultural practices that prepared graduates to serve Sorbian communities while maintaining scholarly standards that earned recognition from broader European academic institutions. Seminary records reveal the systematic collection and preservation of Sorbian manuscripts, folk songs, and cultural artifacts that form the foundation for later ethnographic research and cultural preservation efforts. The development of Sorbian printing capabilities during the 18th century enabled the systematic production of Sorbian language literature that extended beyond religious texts to include secular works addressing practical subjects like agriculture, medicine, and legal procedures that serve the daily needs of Sorbian communities while preserving traditional knowledge systems within written literary forms. The printing house established by Johann Ernst Schmaler in Bautzen during 1767 produced the first secular Sorbian books, including agricultural manuals that combined a traditional Sorbian farming knowledge with contemporary European agricultural innovations, medical guides that preserve traditional herbal medicine within frameworks acceptable to German medical authorities, and legal handbooks that explained German legal procedures while preserving traditional Sorbian approaches to conflict resolution and community governance. Administrative reforms implemented throughout Saxon territories during the reign of Augustus III created new opportunities for Sorbian participation in local governance, while maintaining German administrative oversight through systematic bureaucratic structures that balance community autonomy with state administrative requirements. The Saxon Administrative Code of 1764 formally recognised Sorbian customary law in matters involving family relationships, property inheritance, and local dispute resolution, provided these traditional legal practices did not conflict with Saxon state law or imperial administrative requirements. Contemporary administrative documents reveal the systematic appointment of bilingual officials capable of conducting government business in both German and Sorbian languages, with administrative procedures that accommodated traditional Sorbian community decision-making processes while ensuring Saxon state oversight of all significant political and economic activities. Prussian administrative policies implemented in Sorbian territories acquired during the 7 Years' War reflected different approaches to minority population management that emphasized cultural assimilation through educational and economic incentives, rather than the direct suppression of indigenous cultural practices that had characterized earlier German colonial policies. The Prussian General School Regulation of 1763 required the establishment of German language schools throughout Sorbian regions, while permitting supplementary instruction in Sorbian languages for religious education and basic literacy training that could facilitate German language acquisition among Sorbian children. Educational records from this period reveal complex negotiations between Prussian educational authorities and Sorbian communities that resulted in bilingual educational programs designed to produce German language competence, while preserving essential elements of Sorbian cultural transmission. The systematic archaeological documentation of Wendish settlement patterns and material culture traditions began during the late 18th century as Enlightenment scholarly interest in historical development and cultural diversity created academic frameworks for studying indigenous European populations that had previously been dismissed as historically insignificant by German scholarly traditions. The archaeological investigations conducted by Johann Christoph Adelung throughout Lusatian regions during the 1780s produced detailed documentation of traditional Wendish fortification systems, burial practices and settlement layouts that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of defensive architecture and community organisation that contradicted German assumptions about Slavic cultural inferiority. Adelung's excavations at sites like Radosh and Berg revealed extensive evidence of advanced metallurgy, ceramic production, and agricultural techniques that indicated technological capabilities comparable to contemporary German communities while maintaining distinctively Slavic cultural characteristics. Burial practices documented through systematic archaeological investigation reveal the persistence of traditional Wendish religious concepts and ceremonial procedures, despite centuries of Christian missionary activity and official prohibition of pagan religious practices. Excavations at Sorbian cemeteries dating from the 16th through 18th centuries uncovered grave goods including traditional jewellery, ceremonial objects, and food offerings that indicated continued adherence to pre-Christian beliefs about death and afterlife despite official Christian burial requirements. The orientation of graves, arrangement of burial objects, and evidence of ceremonial activities at burial sites demonstrated sophisticated religious practices that synthesize Christian theological requirements with traditional Wendish spiritual concepts, while maintaining cultural authenticity and community religious identity. Settlement pattern analysis conducted through systematic field surveys revealed the persistence of traditional Wendish village organisation and agricultural arrangements, despite German administrative efforts to impose standardised colonial settlement forms throughout conquered territories. Traditional Wendish villages typically maintained circular or semicircular layouts, with central communal areas surrounded by family compounds that reflected extended kinship relationships and cooperative agricultural practices that differed significantly from German individual farmstead arrangements. Archaeological evidence from sites like Panschwitz, Kukau and Krostwitz reveals continuous occupation spanning centuries, with building foundations and artifact deposits that demonstrate gradual adaptation to German administrative requirements while preserving essential elements of traditional community organisation and family structure. Material culture studies based on systematic artifact analysis revealed sophisticated craft production traditions that maintained technological competence and artistic distinctiveness while adapting to changing economic circumstances and market relationships throughout the early modern period. Traditional Sorbian pottery production continued to utilise distinctive decorative motifs and vessel forms that preserved pre-Christian symbolic systems while incorporating new functional requirements and aesthetic influences derived from contact with German and broader European ceramic traditions. Archaeological assemblages from craft production sites reveal the systematic maintenance of traditional techniques alongside the adoption of new technologies and production methods that enhance productivity and product quality without compromising cultural authenticity or traditional artistic values. Textile production analysis based on preserved examples and archaeological evidence revealed sophisticated weaving traditions that maintained distinctive Sorbian decorative patterns and colour combinations while adapting to changing fashion preferences and commercial opportunities throughout the early modern period. Traditional Sorbian costume elements documented through museum collections and ethnographic research demonstrate remarkable continuity in basic garment forms and decorative techniques despite changing political circumstances and cultural pressures that might have been expected to eliminate distinctive indigenous clothing traditions. The persistence of traditional textile production techniques required specialized knowledge of local dye plants, fiber processing methods, and weaving patterns that was transmitted through family networks and community institutions that preserved technical expertise across generations despite external pressures for cultural assimilation. Metalworking traditions documented through archaeological investigation and historical analysis revealed continuous production capabilities that maintained traditional decorative motifs and symbolic elements while adapting to changing functional requirements and technological innovations throughout the early modern period. Traditional Sorbian metalwork incorporated religious and ceremonial elements derived from pre-Christian cultural traditions, with decorative patterns and ritual objects that preserved ancient symbolic meanings within contexts that were acceptable to German administrative and religious authorities. Archaeological evidence from metalworking sites reveals sophisticated production techniques and quality control methods that enabled Sorbian craftsmen to produce goods that competed successfully with German craft production while maintaining cultural distinctiveness and traditional artistic values. Agricultural practices documented through systematic analysis of field systems, crop remains, and traditional farming techniques revealed sophisticated land use strategies that maximize productivity from marginal soils and variable climatic conditions, while maintaining ecological sustainability and community food security throughout the early modern period. Traditional Sorbian agricultural knowledge included detailed understanding of soil management, crop rotation, and seasonal timing that enabled successful farming in forest and marshland environments that German colonists often found challenging to cultivate effectively. Archaeological evidence from agricultural sites reveals the persistence of traditional field arrangements and farming techniques, alongside the selective adoption of new crop varieties and agricultural innovations that enhance productivity without requiring fundamental changes in traditional farming practices or community agricultural organisation. Forest management practices preserved through traditional knowledge systems and documented through historical analysis revealed sophisticated understanding of woodland ecology and sustainable resource extraction that enabled Sorbian communities to maintain forest-based economic activities while meeting German administrative requirements for timber and forest product delivery. Traditional Sorbian forest management included controlled burning, selective harvesting, and wildlife management techniques that maintained forest productivity while providing diverse resources including timber, fuel, medicinal plants, and food supplements that supported community subsistence and commercial activities. Contemporary German administrative records acknowledge Sorbian expertise in forest management and frequently relied on traditional knowledge for developing forest exploitation policies and managing woodland resources throughout regions with significant Sorbian populations. The cultural legacy established during this period of consolidation created institutional and intellectual foundations that would enable Sorbian cultural survival through subsequent centuries of political change and assimilationist pressure. The scholarly documentation of Sorbian languages, literature, and cultural traditions provided permanent records that preserved essential cultural knowledge while demonstrating the sophistication and historical significance of Wendish civilization to broader European intellectual communities. The establishment of educational institutions and literary traditions created systematic mechanisms for cultural transmission that could adapt to changing political circumstances while maintaining essential elements of Sorbian identity and cultural continuity. The administrative compromises negotiated between Sorbian communities and German authorities during this period established precedents for minority rights and cultural autonomy that would influence later political developments and provide legal foundations for Sorbian cultural preservation efforts. The formal recognition of Sorbian languages and customary practices within German administrative frameworks created institutional arrangements that balanced assimilationist pressures with practical recognition of cultural diversity and community autonomy. These arrangements demonstrated the possibility of maintaining indigenous cultural identity within dominant political systems while contributing to broader social and economic development through the preservation of traditional knowledge systems and cultural practices that enhanced regional diversity and cultural richness. The transformation of Wendish territories from contested frontier regions to integrated components of German administrative systems represented one of the most comprehensive processes of cultural change and political consolidation in medieval and early modern European history. The survival of Sorbian communities through this extended period of political subordination and cultural pressure demonstrated remarkable adaptability and cultural resilience that preserved essential elements of ancient Wendish civilization while adapting to changing historical circumstances. The scholarly and institutional achievements of the early modern period established foundations for continued Sorbian cultural development that would enable community survival through subsequent political changes while maintaining connections to the broader Slavic cultural world and preserving unique contributions to European cultural diversity that originated in the ancient Wendish settlements along the rivers of Central Europe over a millennium earlier.